This is going to be a bit different video than what you're used to. This is not about fantasy books. It's not about books at all, actually. This is a podcast that I do. It's a long-form history podcast, very much like a Dan Carlin, Danielle Bolelli sort of thing. They're honestly small audiobooks. And the podcast series that I've been working on lately is about the wars in Vietnam, the French War, and then followed by the American War, which I'm about to hop into here soon. 2 episodes are out in this series detailing the French War from about 1945 to 1954. They are big boys, and I figured I would take advantage of this YouTube platform and release them on here as well. If you want to listen to these episodes just in your typical run-of-the-mill audio format, they are available wherever you can get your podcasts. If you will search Compendium, a history collection, they will pop up there. I've also got a website, compendiumshow.com, where you can listen to those and find links to all the things for those as well. But a little bit different, a little bit of a change of pace. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Hell in a Small Place, Part 1. You're listening to Compendium. I'm your host, Josh Johnson. This is episode 1 of my series on the French and American wars in Vietnam. It's a story that is tragic and yet so poignant and relatable to our current time. Something I hope I don't get lost in the weeds trying to tell, but I'll do my very best. If you want to get all future episodes of Compendium early, maybe parts 2 through the end of Hell in a Small Place, you can do that on Patreon. All episodes go out early before anybody else gets the chance to listen to them there. Thank you so much for your support. And without any further ado, Hell in a Small Place, Part 1.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
And night fell on a different world. A world where freedom itself is under attack.
I shall not see, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
I've been trying to think of the best way to start this for a while now. I've done a lot of different false starts and different ways to sort of approach the beginning of this whole story. And it's the kind of story where if you don't keep yourself down the straight and narrow path, you'll find yourself meandering off into the weeds. And a lot of times those meanderings can be really fun and intriguing, but sometimes you go off into the weeds and then you look up and you don't even know where you are anymore. The story of Vietnam and America's involvement in the many wars in Vietnam is kind of like that. Sometimes you meander off into the weeds and you come up for air, you're looking around, and you don't know how you got there and you don't know where to go next. Initially, I had planned this to be a couple-part series, and maybe 3 hours total, where you just focus on the American War in Vietnam, and then started reading the books and realized, oh no, this is not a 3-hour series. This is going to be quite a bit larger than that, and we're not going to start with America's war in Vietnam. We're going to start with the French one. You see, while I like to approach things from this is the part that you didn't learn in school. This entire thing is probably something you didn't learn in school. I was talking with my wife at dinner maybe a week ago, and I was verbally processing a bit what was going to be happening in this podcast series and just talking about how fascinating it is that, especially with the American war in Vietnam, Americans don't learn about that war in school. And it seems so odd. It seems so important and integral to what America is today. A lot of the different events that happened during the 1960s and the late 1950s into the 70s seem to have echoes and reflections that come up now in the 2020s. And two, it's a conflict where a lot of the people that fought in that conflict are still alive today. In fact, we're going to talk later about the battle at Dien Bien Phu in the French Indochina War, and this year, 2024, is the 70-year anniversary of that battle, and people who fought in that battle went back to the battlefield just a few months ago. And so you have kind of this weird, it's past, but it's also present. Is it a past as prologue kind of thing, or is this a current event sort of thing? It's a weird dichotomy where a lot of the events that we're going to talk about are something that if you just go find the right person to talk to, you can step into that moment in time that didn't really happen that long ago, but it feels like it sort of did. You're seeing events in the mirror, and they feel like they should have been happening far, far in the past, and yet they're relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. And it leads to a lot of questions, like how is this something that you don't learn about? What are the reasons that lead to Americans not really learning about this conflict and this struggle? I don't know. I don't like to consider myself a conspiracy theorist, but you do sort of wonder, like, why is this something you don't learn about? And in that conversation with my wife, she said to me, I didn't learn anything about the American war in Vietnam, much less the French one. Are you kidding? I was like, yeah, me neither. Why is that? And as I've been sort of mentally debriefing before turning on the microphone, I keep coming back to a quote in Max Hastings' book, Vietnam. And I can't remember if this is a quote where he's quoting somebody else or if this is something he's saying, but the essence of it, it's very simple and short and succinct. It's that Americans, the United States, cannot suffer a loser. And so you wonder, was this conflict a debacle enough that Americans are like, we just don't need to talk about that? You compare it to World War I, World War II, the phrase that's often said in jest, maybe not in jest, I don't know, it depends on who you're talking to, is America's 2-0 in world wars, undefeated in world wars. And then if you throw in the American Revolution, it's like, oh, well, undefeated in that war. Don't talk about the war in 1812, but if you think about, the American Civil War, the Revolutionary War, the World Wars, the Korean War even, America doesn't lose wars. But then you throw in the Vietnam War, and it's like, ooh, there's the bruise. There's the one you don't need to talk about. I don't know if that has anything to do with it at all. But as you dive more into the sources, and the sources seem to grow every year, there's this common thread where America and its American citizens grew so disillusioned with the war that it turned into a political issue at home, and that political issue at home tended to bleed into the war effort over in Vietnam. And it's not that dissimilar with what was happening with the French, which is why you start with the French War in Indochina, which is happening immediately after World War II. And that just feels like it's so out of place. I mean, this story begins, it really could begin in the early 1900s, but it begins in earnest in 1945, not too long after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's one of those things where you're sort of comparing historical eras and you think, yeah, Vietnam is a 1960s, 1970s thing only, but it's not. It's something that stretches so far back, and it encompasses a lot of different things. And Vietnam's quote-unquote war for independence, if you want to call it that, or if you want to call it the colonial wars, it encompasses a lot of different ideologies and themes, and it's something where you find yourself in the weeds. I'll try and stay on the straight and narrow, but there's no promises there. But as I was trying to figure out where you start with a subject like this, it seems there is a central figure gluing the story together. and that figure is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a communist that was integral in the founding of the Viet Minh, later the Viet Cong, later the NVA. There's going to be a lot of different names and things. We'll try and stick together, and hopefully at the other side we'll all understand what's going on. But Ho Chi Minh, if you can imagine, just this really small, skinny guy, incredibly unimpressive, piercing eyes, thoughtful, not an impressive man that you would point out as being one of the most powerful men in a room, and yet he's often attributed as the father of Vietnamese independence, if you want to go that far. Certainly one of the most integral figures in this entire conflict. And fittingly, this guy is known for, trotting all over Vietnam on foot, doesn't ride in cars. He doesn't really have, you'd think of a presidential figure or an important political figure having like a motorcade around him all the time, Secret Service sorts of figures. No. Ho Chi Minh, he just has this mystique as an ascetic, a guy who deprives himself of all the things that ideologically he opposes, which in this case is, first world kind of amenities, things that the French would have that the Americans later would have. He's trotting around in the mountains. He gets frostbite at one point, attending a parade as a young man for Lenin. Just an interesting figure. One of the central mysteries of this story is, who is Ho Chi Minh? Because to push through some of the propaganda and the things that later North Vietnam would put out about Ho Chi Minh, it's what, they would tell local peasants to call him. They'd call him Uncle Ho. They would try and create this sort of familiarity with him as if he was looking out for your best interests. He's, a second father figure. And when you sort of combine the fact that for the Vietnamese, the family is the central axis around which everything kind of revolves, if you're referring to Ho Chi Minh as your uncle, as a member of your immediate family, it's creating this familiarity with him he's somebody who can be trusted, that he's got Vietnam's best interests at heart. And a lot of times he presents himself that way, as somebody he's just fighting for Vietnamese independence. He just wants to throw off the colonial overlords, and he's doing it in a way that's approachable at times, at least politically. When he's meeting with different political figures, he's often coming as a humble, subservient sort of person. He's powerful in his own way, but you can tell he's not quite as domineering of a room the way some other leaders tend to be. But he's arresting at the same time. And a lot of times when people describe him, they describe him as an incredibly impressive character, even though from the outside looking in, he doesn't look incredibly impressive. And Ho Chi Minh tends to toe the line between giving and taking, and he's at times, negotiating with Soviets, he's negotiating with Chinese, but then also going to meet with the French and the Americans at the same time, and he's kind of towing the party line, as it were, with both of them, where he's got to appease these communist countries to his north that if he pisses them off, they're going to come down and conquer Vietnam with the, snap of two fingers. But then also you've got the French, who are the colonial overlords, and you've got the Americans who are kind of backing the French, and you got to keep them happy too, so that, when you are picking which avenue you want to go down politically for Vietnam's sake, there's a lot of different lines to toe. And so there's this weird, who is Ho Chi Minh? And at times you think that he might be different people in different rooms, that when presented in different scenarios, he might adjust how he approaches these different meetings. He might meet differently with Americans than he would with Soviets or with the Chinese. But even still, it's a lot of what you find about Ho Chi Minh. You're doing some guesswork. There's not a lot known about him, and there wasn't a lot known about him by the Vietnamese. He was a bit of a mystery. In Leli Hayslip's book, When Heaven and Earth Changed Places, she was somebody who fought for the Viet Cong in the American war in Vietnam. And so she talks about how she would go to these indoctrination sessions in northern Vietnam and how they would talk about Ho Chi Minh and how they would talk about Vietnam as a country and kind of like what the whole purpose was behind this whole conflict. She writes, quote, "In the north, on the other pole, was Ho Chi Minh, whom we were encouraged to call Bac Ho, Uncle Ho, the way we would refer to a trusted family friend. We knew nothing of his past just beyond stories of compassion and his love for our troubled country, the independence of which, we were told, he had made the mission of his life." She talks further about, the purpose of the Viet Minh, later the Viet Cong, and how there's this weird towing of the line between communism and nationalism. And that tends to be a talking point that people argue over the world round when it comes to this Vietnam issue, this issue of Vietnamese independence. Is it a communist country trying to take over Vietnam? Or is communism just sort of the vehicle with which Vietnam can gain its independence? Is independence the end goal, or is communism the end goal? And depending on who you talk to, you're going to get different answers at this time. Hayslip talks about how Ho Chi Minh would preach independence, and this is what she says about it, quote, "But to achieve that independence, Ho said, we must wage total war. His cadremen cried out, 'We must hold together and oppose the American empire. There is nothing better than freedom, independence, and happiness.' To us, these ideas seemed as obvious as everything else we had heard. Freedom meant a Vietnam free of colonial domination. Independence meant one Vietnamese people, not two countries, north and south. Happiness meant plenty of food and an end to the war, the ability, we assumed, to live our lives in accordance with our ancient ways. We wondered, how can Southerners oppose these wonderful things? The answer the Viet Cong gave us was that the Republicans prized Yankee dollars more than the blood of our brothers and sisters. We did not think to question with our hearts what our minds told us must be true." I think the more I've researched this subject, obviously there's a whole lot that you can't know for sure about Ho Chi Minh, about the founding of the Vietnamese Communist Party, about this whole genesis of the whole deal. But what I've realized more and more is it seems almost like Ho Chi Minh is a bit of a mascot character. Ho Chi Minh in Vietnamese means bringer of light. And it's not even Ho Chi Minh's original name. He sort of adopts this name when he's older, when he's in his 50s, and he comes to Vietnam to sort of establish the Communist Party there. In his book, Vietnam, Max Hastings talks about when Ho Chi Minh shows up on the scene in northern Vietnam and how he comes to this cave and has this meeting with several other future key figures in this whole story, Pham Van Dong, Vo Nguyen Giap being a couple of them. But I'll let Max Hastings give us the scene for how this kind of all comes together. Giap at first introduced Ho to the little guerrilla group by saying, "Comrades, this is an old man, native of this area, a farmer who loves the revolution." But they quickly realized that this was no local, and certainly no farmer. Ho drew maps of Hanoi for those who had never seen it and advised them to dig latrines. A veteran recalled, "We thought to ourselves, who is this old man? Of all the things he could tell us, he gives us advice about how to take a shit." Nonetheless, Ho was readily accepted as leader of the group, and indeed of the new movement, which they called the Vietnam Independence League, shortened to Viet Minh. Its leaders did not disguise their own ideological commitment, but only much later did they explicitly avow communism as their only permitted creed. Based on that, you get the sense that, in answer to that previous question, is the communism versus nationalism thing. Like, is communism the end goal or is independence the end goal? You get the sense there's a little bit of both. I think depending on who you read, you're going to get different answers to that story, and I think a lot of people have been arguing that for years. But it seems that it's not quite as cut and dry as these are communists trying to kind of establish a communist state, or it's not as cut and dry as these are just people that want independence and communism happened to be the way that they could get it. Later on, Ho Chi Minh would admit something along the lines of, we feel communism is essentially the way to go, the way to have our government set up, but ultimately the goal is independence of Vietnam. But then later on, when you see some of the things that they do, it's kind of difficult to know whether or not this is just all in thrall of establishing an authoritarian sort of communist state, or if it's just for the independence of Vietnam. You know, they were telling new recruits later on for the Viet Cong that they felt that Vietnam had its own right to a sovereign state, that everybody has the right to govern themselves, which I think a lot of people in the free world would agree with. It's a sentiment we all can get behind, right? The land of the free, the home of the brave, that every man has certain inalienable rights, those kinds of things. And the propaganda machine of the Viet Minh and later the Viet Cong played upon these ideologies because, you know, the way to win, quote unquote, hearts and minds is to kind of join them to a movement which the central goal appears to be one that everybody can get behind. And then this new league, the Viet Minh, are given, in a roundabout way, a gift when in 1945 there's a massive famine in Vietnam. And then people on the ground, the people suffering, the people in this famine that are dying, start to look around at the French, their overlords, and this Viet Minh group that's passing out aid to people. And they're starting to wonder internally, like, who would I rather have governing me? Somebody who looks like me, somebody who's helping me, somebody who is a group that's sending out aid to my family and friends, or would I rather be subservient to a foreign country that, you know, doesn't care about me, that just wants to preserve their foreign empire? Would I rather be subservient to them, or would I rather, you know, go along with a movement that appears to be something that has my best interest at heart, a la the Uncle Ho thing? It does seem that while nearly 3 million people died from famine in Vietnam, that was kind of the linchpin moment when the Viet Minh were able to establish themselves as the government for the people that just happened to be a communist government. And again, that issue of, is it communist? Is it nationalist? What's the deal here? And what do they want? It's kind of all shrouded. In 1946, Ho Chi Minh's talking with American journalist David Schoenbrunn. And Ho Chi Minh did this quite a lot when he would go to foreign countries. In this case, he's in Paris. He's playing the Americans and the French, but he's also playing the Soviets and the Chinese. And in this case, he's trying to get the Americans involved, to come on the side of the Vietnamese government, to push the French out. He says, quote, "Your country can play a vital role for peace in Southeast Asia. The memory of Roosevelt is still strong. You never had an empire, never exploited the Asian peoples. The example you set in the Philippines was an inspiration to all of us." He's talking about when the American government recognized the Philippines as a sovereign nation. "Your ties with France are strong and durable, and you have great influence in this country. I urge you to report to your people the need there is to swing the balance toward peace and independence before it is too late for all of us. Do not be blinded by this issue of communism." And then Schoenbrunn, as is kind of usual with the U.S. approach to communism, said that Americans don't think communism's compatible with freedom. Ho Chi Minh nodded in understanding, but said the Vietnamese people would not rest until true independence had been won. Quote, "If men you call communists are the only men who lead the fight for independence, then Vietnam will be communist. Independence is the motivating force, not communism.
On the issue of independence and the unity of North and South, we are all in agreement. Communists, Catholics, Republicans, peasants, workers. If we must, we will fight together for those aims. And that tends to be the common thread with a lot of what you find about Ho Chi Minh, is that he says things like, Vietnam will not be communist for like 50 more years. He says that over and over and over again, trying to downplay the fact that it is a communist government. America's terrified of that. And especially as things heat up about the issue of communism in 1950s and then into the 60s, when it becomes such a taboo that people are absolutely horrified by the concept of it, he has to play it down even further. And, by the time the 50s and 60s come, it's too far gone anyway. But this time in the 40s, this is 1946 when he's saying this, communism is not such a hot topic thing. I mean, the Soviets were communist in Russia, but everybody's concerned with fascism, with Nazism at this point, and with this hardcore nationalism that has kind of swept through Europe, and we're just terrified of a replication of what the Nazis did in Germany. And Ho Chi Minh recognizes that, yeah, communism doesn't sound appeasing to the West, but that's not the end goal. We just play up this idea of Vietnamese independence, which, of course, Americans can all get behind, just like the Vietnamese can get behind. Everybody loves the idea of Vietnamese independence, of a government by the Vietnamese people for the Vietnamese people. He knows that's going to touch a nice chord with Americans, but still, Americans are concerned about the communism issue. Then Schoenbrunn apparently, in this conversation, replied to Ho Chi Minh in 1946. He said, according to, this is Embers of War by Frederick Lochvoll, Schoenbrunn says, quote, "But President Ho, this is extraordinary. How can you hope to wage war against the French? You have no army. You have no modern weapons. Why, such a war would seem hopeless to you." Ho Chi Minh replied, quote, "No, it would not be hopeless. It would be hard, desperate, but we could win." And this sort of leads us to the other issue that the West never fully comprehended. This idea of guerrilla warfare, of revolutionary warfare, as Bernard Fall would call it. It's this idea of the few facing off the many and winning. It seems almost anathema to the West, where we are conditioned to expect a decisive battle. And in a decisive battle, obviously numbers are forefront. A lot of times they say, if you want to invade a country and take them out, you only need a 3-to-1 numbers difference. You need 3 times more men than they've got to comfortably win to take them out. And that's sort of, if you're playing by the book, that's how you would approach it. But when you're fighting guerrilla warfare, nobody knew exactly how to do this thing. And numbers would later come out later on in the mid-1960s. Bernard Fall would say in 1964 that you would need like a 25-to-1 numbers difference in order to win a guerrilla war. Well, how's that even possible? That seems like if you have 25 times the men and firepower that the enemy does, that's easy. You just clean them out. In fact, the French would say to Ho Chi Minh when he's in Paris at this same time in 1946 that if the Viet Minh wouldn't clean things up and get out of there, the French would just send a police force and they'd take the Viet Minh out. Because you have this conditioned idea that, in order to win a war on foreign soil like that, all you'd need is just a few guys, because the Viet Minh, they don't even have modern weapons. They don't even really have an army. When Vo Nguyen Giap puts together the first People's Army of Vietnam, there's like 6,000 guys, and they are, sharing weapons between them. They don't even have uniforms. I mean, they're bringing their own food kind of thing. It's like this communal, everybody shows up, bring what you've got for the cause, and then we're going to go fight a war. It's done on such a crazy shoestring deal that it seems impossible that Vietnam, if it came to war with the French to push the French oppressors out, it seems impossible that they could win. And yet Ho Chi Minh believes that they can. Why? Ho Chi Minh told Schoenbrunn, quote, It will be a war between an elephant and a tiger. If the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him with his mighty tusks. But the tiger does not stand still. He lurks in the jungle by day and emerges only at night. He will leap upon the back of the elephant, tearing huge chunks from his hide, and then he will leap back into the dark jungle, and slowly the elephant will bleed to death. That will be the war of Indochina." End quote. A lot of books on this war kind of dive into this idea of guerrilla warfare. And it's really interesting to read Bernard Fall, who's writing immediately after the French War, and he's kind of the authoritative voice on the French War in Indochina, because at that point, Americans, they don't even know what Vietnam is. And it goes under different names. It's called Indochina by the French. It's divided up into 3 sections. You have Tonkin in the north, you have Annam in the middle, and then in the south, they call it Cochin China. And so it doesn't even have this sort of cohesive name, or it's not even recognized as a country, so people don't even know what it is. And when you're dealing with this idea of guerrilla warfare, or what we would now call counterinsurgency, it's just not understood. And Vo Nguyen Giap, who is the general for Vietnam in the French War and then later the American War, he's a student of Mao Zedong's approaches to guerrilla warfare. Nguyen Binh, who was a member of Ho Chi Minh's government, has a quote in Embers of War by Frederick Logval about what guerrilla warfare is. Quote, "The miracle of the guerrilla is that the whole population contributes. The soldier is the inhabitant, and the inhabitant is the soldier. The tactics consist of avoiding well-guarded positions, attacking posts where the garrison is weak, advancing if the enemy retreats, and retreating if the enemy advances, organizing ambushes where the enemy will be overcome by numbers in spite of his value. One of the guerrilla tactics consists in making the enemy blind. Our soldiers do not wear uniforms, they don't concentrate in barracks, and they slip through the crowds that hide them if necessary. In that way, the French soldiers are incapable of detecting their presence." So it all kind of gets rolled up into one, the idea of guerrilla warfare, of what is the point of Vietnamese nationalism or communism. It all kind of becomes this one ball of yarn where you can pull at different threads, but it's all interconnected. Essentially, if you want to make it its simplest form, the Vietnamese government fundamentally understood something the West never did. That if you could get the people to fight for you, you were going to win. And it didn't matter if you didn't have the same weapons or equipment that later the Americans and French would have. If you could just get the locals to be on board with whatever cause it is you're fighting for, you can win with guerrilla tactics, where you show up, you blow up a couple things, and then you melt away into the forest. And it also helps, especially in the case of Vietnam, if you're doing this in the jungle, where you understand the lay of the land. It seems like all of these elements came together to form kind of the perfect concoction for a Vietnamese victory. You have this fundamental belief ideologically that Vietnam should be an independent sovereign nation, which the Viet Minh played up. And then on top of that, you kind of marry that belief with a partnership with local people that will kind of support you, that'll be porters, that'll carry food for your soldiers, and then will be soldiers for you. And if you can just get a little bit of outside aid from, Russia, China, America, France, whoever's going to give you aid, if you can get some weapons, to actually have something to fight with, then you're golden. You just show up, blow something up, melt away into the jungle over and over and over again until your enemy has had enough. And that seemed to be the game plan of the Vietnamese government. And you contrast that with what the French wanted to do, which was bring the enemy to a decisive battle. And they thought that Vo Nguyen Giap, he was just this amateur general. He was a former school teacher and taught himself basically how to command a war. And so the French were like, ugh, who's this little guy? He's not going to defeat our best generals who fought in World War II or veterans of all kinds of different wars. It's kind of like if you think about it in sports terms, like in football terms, different teams tend to have different identities. And they say in boxing, styles make fights. This is a styles thing where the West has a certain style and a way of fighting that is fundamentally different to how the East wants to fight. The East is going to use the terrain to their, advantage, whereas the West is like, we're going to come in, we're going to bring a bunch of men, a lot of divisions, a lot of tanks, a lot of planes, and we're just going to blow stuff up. And we're going to sweep you off the field because we have, this Western dominance and this fundamental kind of advantage in our firepower and in our numbers. But the Vietnamese are fine. They're totally fine with just showing up, blowing things up, and melting away. And the French get frustrated because, they can't fight the way the Vietnamese want to fight. They're not trained that way, but they want to bring the Vietnamese onto their playing field, and the Vietnamese just never do it. Now, I said at the outset that this conflict sort of really starts in earnest in 1945. And I've kind of danced around that. Again, I said I wasn't going to go into the weeds, and we've kind of gone into the weeds a little bit. But all of this stuff is important in sort of understanding all the many different parts at play here. And there's a lot. And the reason why all of these things are important to know is because the Vietnam conflict, as we find out when we get further into this, it's a political conflict much more than it's just strictly a military one. Obviously, the military plays a large part in a lot of the things that are going to happen here, but the reason why I say things like, who is Ho Chi Minh? What is the Viet Minh organizationally? Is it a communist organization? Is it, purely a nationalist thing? These are all questions that sort of factor into why other countries do some of the things that they end up doing. And it sort of has this trickle-down effect. There's the communist nationalist question regarding Vietnam, but then also with other great powers in the world, there's this colonialism sort of question about what is Vietnam going to look like after World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had his own idea of what Vietnam might look like and how the world stage might affect what Vietnam would end up looking like. It's almost difficult to sort of illustrate why Vietnam is so important, but it ends up becoming this linchpin for a lot of what post-World War II, the world stage might look like. Because it's kind of in this pocket where it's right underneath Soviet Russia, it's right underneath China, so they have easy access to it as well. And it seems like, based on a lot of policy that's made at the time and how people viewed Indochina, viewed Vietnam, those terms used interchangeably there, that everybody believed Indochina was going to be the crux of whatever happened next in the future. FDR had this idea of trusteeship, as he called it, as the way to move forward with Indochina and with other countries as well. It wasn't limited to just Vietnam. It was also Laos and Cambodia and, the islands. The United States gave the Philippines their independence, as Ho Chi Minh mentioned earlier. And the United States did this kind of in stages where essentially at the end of it, they allowed the Philippines to enter the United States as a protectorate or something like that. But they did it in kind of this, we grant you independence kind of thing to rule yourselves, all the stuff that plays really well with, the United States, right? It's kind of in their DNA to do things this way, to approach stewarding, quote unquote, lesser countries. You don't tell them that they're a lesser country. You treat them like little brother a little bit. You give them some freedoms and let them think that they're operating independently of United States hands in policy. But of course, everybody knows that if the United States wants something done, that something will end up getting done regardless of, the idea of independence. But anyway, the United States granted the Philippines their independence, and FDR had the idea to sort of take the blueprint for what the United States did with the Philippines and apply it to a lot of these other Asian countries. In Frederick Logval's book, Embers of War, he sort of details what FDR is trying to get done with other major powers in the world at the time. He says, quote, "But if Indochina and potentially other colonies should not be returned to the colonial powers after the war, what should happen to them? Roosevelt proposed a trusteeship formula by which the colonies would be raised to independence through several stages. Those not ready for independence, which in FDR's view included all of France's possessions, namely Indochina, would be placed under a non-exploitive international trusteeship formed by the United Nations." Now, it's really interesting because in the Allied powers, there kind of became this idea that there were going to be four policemen, as it were, for international policy after World War II. Those big four were going to be Great Britain, the United States, Soviet Russia, and China. And so they're all working together trying to figure out, what are we going to do with the world stage after World War II is over? How are we going to dictate how world policy in broad strokes kind of goes? And you would think that these Allied powers would sort of come to an agreement on how they would approach, this idea of colonialism or non-colonialism, but they don't. If you dive into some of the weeds there about why that might be, you realize that basically every country has their own vested interests at play that are going to affect how they would approach this thing. For example, Great Britain doesn't want to give up her empire. It's kind of baked into the national identity that they are bringing civilization to some of these other third world places, and they're doing it by governing these places and enriching themselves. And it's part of Great Britain's policy that they're not really on board with the whole trusteeship idea, because that means granting independence to some of these colonies, or all of these colonies that they've established over a couple hundred years. For Great Britain, that's not going to fly. The other part, too, is Japan had been really active in colonizing Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian islands. On its face, you look at FDR talking about anti-colonialism as some of the things that we would equate it with later, like with Great Britain's empire, with France's empire. But subtly hidden under all of that, it's this approach of cutting Japan down at the knees. If you basically get all your Allied powers on board with, well, we got to get rid of Japan's colonies, which they were all on board with, you have some agreement there. But the disagreement came when you're trying to figure out what are you going to do after you get rid of Japan's holdings. But like I said, every member of this big four, of these four policemen, had a different idea of how this was going to go. The British, according to Logval in Embers of War, thought about it this way, quote, "It annoyed London strategists that the American president seemed so oblivious both to Indochina's geostrategic importance and to the need to have a strong and stable France in post-war Europe. For them, Indochina was the linchpin of all Southeast Asia, a barrier between China to the north and a string of prized British possessions to the south. Japan had used it as a forward base for her operations against Malaya and Burma, and this could not be allowed to happen again. Post-war Indochina thus needed to be kept peaceful and stable, and France was in a better position than anyone else to ensure that happened." Then on the other hand, Joseph Stalin and the Soviets in Russia kind of had their own approach to how the geopolitical space might look in Southeast Asia after World War II. Again, from Embers of War. And this is from a conversation that Stalin and Winston Churchill had. Quote, "Churchill pledged that Britain would seek no new territory after the war, but since the Big Four would be charged with maintaining post-war stability, they should be given individual control over certain strategically valuable areas. After Roosevelt took ill and retired for the night, Stalin continued to press Churchill on the need to keep France from reclaiming her empire. His concern was not the Indo-Chinese people per se. He cared little about Southeast Asia, and his mistrust of Ho Chi Minh, dating back to their encounters in the 1920s, had not disappeared. Rather, he saw his stance as a means to weaken the European colonial empires more generally, and to ensure that the France that emerged from the war was a minor player on the world stage. In essence, Britain wants to maintain their own holdings in Southeast Asia, and they viewed Vietnam or Indochina as a buffer state between the Chinese in the north and the Soviets. The Soviets view Indochina as a means to undercut France and Britain's control on Southeast Asia. And the U.S. is sort of in this split spot where they want to maintain control on the world stage in Southeast Asia, but they don't like the flavor of colonialism for being the means for doing that. And then there's China. At this point, China is controlled by Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek and FDR seemed to agree on the trusteeship plan. In fact, the two of them were allied in this plan, sort of against the British and against Stalin. In a counterfactual, you could sort of wonder what might have the world stage looked like had things not changed in China. But communists under the leadership of Mao Zedong took over China and deposed Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. So then China is sort of no longer a member of the Big Four. FDR sort of reiterated his stance on Vietnam, on Indochina, on March 8th, 1943. Again, from Embers of War, quote, FDR remarked that he and Stalin had agreed that trusteeship, not colonization, was required in Indochina, and he ordered Wedemeyer, who was the commander of China Theater Forces, not to provide any supplies whatsoever to French forces operating in Asia. National independence was the wave of the future, he said, not empires or spheres of influence. And when he died, he sort of sank and stagnated a lot of U.S.'s plans for Southeast Asia. And that combined with China's inability to sort of hold up their end of the bargain, the whole trusteeship idea kind of fell by the wayside. But then on April 12th, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. So FDR passes away, and then things begin to heat up in China as Mao and his communists begin to gain power in China, and China sort of fades away off the stage here and no longer is a member of the Big Four, certainly starting in 1949, but even in the lead up to that, as they're starting to turn increasingly inward, they no longer focus on Vietnam. There's this idea that countries that have had a monarchy for a long period of time, you sort of flip a coin or roll a dice every time a new monarch comes to power, because you don't really know what you're going to get, especially when you have this hereditary from father to son sort of thing. They take over the government and the foreign policy and all the stuff that comes along with that. It's a true dice roll. It's a flip of the coin. When you go from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who handled World War II policy the way he did, demonstrably, to a guy like Harry Truman, who didn't really have the gravitas that FDR seemed to have, there's going to be things that change. And it's a bit of a flip of a coin, a roll of the dice to see what are you going to get. And as World War II is raging, it seems that Truman and his administration kind of let policy on Indochina and in Southeast Asia kind of fall by the wayside. It seemed like, on the priority list, Vietnam, Indochina, it's pretty far down there, which, it makes sense. You're trying to win a world war here, and you're trying to get rid of the Japanese. And dealing with the Japanese clearly became the forefront of how America was going to operate in Southeast Asia. Again, from Embers of War by Logval, quote, Truman had none of FDR's personal interest in French Indochina's future, and his administration from the start focused its energies on the pressing tasks of securing the victory over the reeling Germans and delivering a knockout blow to Japan. Precisely for those reasons, however, astute observers quickly saw a change in Washington's position on what ought to happen in post-war Indochina. Truman probably knew little or nothing of Roosevelt's trusteeship scheme, and neither he nor his top foreign policy aide, James Burns, the former Supreme Court Justice and Director of War Mobilization, gave much thought to the broader issue of colonial nationalism. So, as the trusteeship idea dies for how to move forward with Southeast Asia, things start to change. And the international approach to Southeast Asia, it basically just turns a blind eye to Indochina, and it's focused solely on Japan. Then, of course, in a twist of fate, Japan turns its own attention to Vietnam. Japan saw Indochina as a highway to ferry resources to their troops dealing with China. Yeah, you got to think about it too. The French got destroyed by Germany, for lack of a better term. You know, they had not acquitted themselves super well, and I don't think the Japanese paid much mind to the idea that the French were going to cause much of an issue. And that's illustrated when on March 6th, 1945, a Japanese ambassador showed up and gave them an ultimatum. He showed up around 6 p.m. in the evening. He appeared nervous, apparently, but he showed up and he gave an ultimatum from his superiors to the French, and it basically said, get out or else. They gave them a deadline of 9 p.m. the same night. So you got 3 hours to figure out if you're going to abandon your entire holdings in Indochina. So you got to make this decision quick, and it's pretty obvious that the Japanese did not think France was going to acquiesce. You have to wonder at this moment what the French officials are thinking when, you know, this is something they have seen on the horizon, right? Japan has been making moves, and it's not necessarily a surprise, at least according to the sources I've read, but at the same time, the efficiency with which Japanese soldiers execute their next move had to be appalling. You get a 3-hour time period with which you're able to decide whether or not you're going to surrender an entire colony to Japanese forces that you probably know you can't do anything about. In Embers of War, Frederick Logval again writes about this whole moment of flux when Japan executes its move seemingly overnight. Quote, certainly the French were taken by surprise, even though they had drawn up plans to counter just this kind of Japanese thrust, and even though intelligence reports had warned that an attack might be imminent, one by one that evening their garrisons fell. Almost without exception, the senior French commanders were captured in their homes or in those of Japanese officers with whom they were dining, the meal invitations being part of the ruse. In Saigon, Japanese forces moved immediately on Decoud's palace and seized him as well as several other high-ranking French ministers. Throughout Indochina, they took over administrative buildings and public utilities and seized radio stations, banks, and industries. Public beatings and executions of colonial officials occurred in numerous locales, and there were widespread reports of French women being raped by Japanese soldiers, including in Bokjang province, where the province resident's wife was gang raped. As part of this coup, the Japanese do something that seems to be kind of the example for how this sort of thing can be done in the future. They pull out the puppet emperor, Bao Dai. Bao Dai is an interesting character in and of himself, but he is the official emperor of Vietnam, the hereditary ruler of the Nguyen dynasty. His name, Bao Dai, means something along the lines of like keeper of greatness. You got to think over the history of humanity, some of the great titles for kings. I always think of the Achaemenid Persian Empire naming their kings, the King of Kings. And Baodai was the keeper of greatness, or like the protector of divinity, or something like that. Even in his title, you could sort of see a representation of what his role was in Vietnamese politics. It's clearly not a title that, shows domination over other countries or kings. It's a title that's like, this is somebody to look to, but he's not really in charge, the protector of greatness. His position as sort of a figurehead holds a lot of sway over Vietnamese people. And the Japanese come in and establish Bao Dai as their puppet emperor on the heels of this coup. It's funny, too, they had a backup plan. If Bao Dai wasn't going to cooperate with them, they had somebody else that they could sort of insert to be the new emperor, just in case Bao Dai wasn't going to play along, do exactly what the Japanese wanted him to do. And on March 11th, 1945, the Japanese declare Vietnam a protectorate of the Empire of Japan. The French poet Jean-Paul Sartre had sort of encapsulated all that had taken place here for the French in just a short period of time where, if you have noticed, the French are not even at these quote-unquote Big Four meetings. You've got Churchill, you've got Stalin, Chiang Kai-shek, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but there's no French representation at these meetings. And yet, the French are obviously pivotal to a lot of the stuff that's going to happen in Southeast Asia, but you can see how they are important, but they're clearly inferior. And at home, in France, in Paris, as different governments are sort of taking over one after the other one, there's this notion at home that France has lost its luster. The poet wrote, quote, "In the space of 5 years, we have acquired a formidable inferiority complex." End quote. Now, what's fascinating about this Japanese coup is that it allowed there to be sort of this opening where Viet Minh operators could, they're not being persecuted by the French secret police anymore, which, the French secret police have been playing whack-a-mole with members of the Indochinese Communist Party, which populated the Viet Minh. And now that they are free and the Japanese focus on urban areas, the Viet Minh can operate in the rural areas. In Bernard Fall's book, Street Without Joy, Fall says about this moment when the Viet Minh are able to kind of capitalize on this power vacuum happening now that the Japanese have kicked the French out or, literally killed everybody who is worth a token of resistance. Fall says, quote, "When VJ Day dawned, the Viet Minh were the only group of any size in Vietnam to exploit the power vacuum existing in the area. Their communist training gave them an unbeatable head start over the small idealistic nationalist groups, which now began to squabble over details while the communists were taking over the country under their very noses. A small book published by Trong Chin, then the Secretary General of the Indochinese Communist Party, which is completely unknown in the West, shows clearly how the Viet Minh took over the country and the anti-colonial revolution. On August 13th, 1945, the ICP, that Communist Party, met at the village of Tan Trao. According to Trong Chin, now quoting Chin, Fall continues, quote, "The ICP met in a national congress, decreed the general uprising, and put into place the Vietnamese Democratic Republican regime. The National Congress began at the very moment when the order of general insurrection had been given. Thus, its session was rapidly closed. In the course of this history-making Congress, the ICP proposed a clear-cut program. Guide the rebels so as to disarm the Japanese before the arrival of the Allies in Indochina, to take over the power that was in the hands of the Japanese and their puppets, and to receive as the authority and control of the country the Allied forces coming to demobilize the Japanese." Now, from March to August 1945, a lot of things happen really quickly. First, the Japanese came into Vietnam to better fight the Americans. They felt that they could supply their forces in the south of China, and that they were going to be able to use that as a launching off point to deal with U.S. forces moving through the Pacific Islands. But, of course, in August 1945, the atomic bombs drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then Japan announces its intention to surrender on August 10th, and then formally surrenders September 2nd. You'll notice that this meeting of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party happens on August 11th, the day after Japan formally acknowledges that they're going to surrender. So they are taking advantage of every little bit that they're given. And on top of all of this, there's that famine that I was talking about. On the low end, estimates of dead in the famine are 1 million people died. And on the high end, about 1.5 million. It was a terrible, terrible famine in 1945. And part of this whole process of taking over and filling in the vacuum of power after Japan is kind of being beaten by the U.S. is that the Viet Minh start supplying to the people. They start giving out rice, kind of filling the needs that arise there and taking care and, quote unquote, winning hearts and minds. And they just so happened to be at the right place at the right time when Japan surrendered and withdrew from Vietnam. So two things have happened. The French have been destroyed by the Japanese, and then the Japanese were destroyed by the U.S., and so the Japanese withdrew. And now nobody is in charge of Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh made sure that this opportunity would not go to waste. So the Viet Minh gather in Hanoi in the north of Vietnam, and in front of a crowd of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh gives a speech. Here's what he said according to Max Hastings in his book, Vietnam. Quote, he declared, meaning Ho Chi Minh, he declared, quote, the French have fled, the Japanese have capitulated, Emperor Bao Dai has abdicated, our people have broken the fetters which for over a century have tied us down. End quote. As part of this whole example that the Japanese gave, Ho Chi Minh convinced Bao Dai to kind of abdicate in favor of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was a front for the Viet Minh, and Ho Chi Minh declared that Bao Dai would be the, quote, supreme advisor, I say that with air quotes, the supreme advisor to Ho Chi Minh's DRV, or Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So you're keeping around the guy that the locals, that the people respect as the emperor, and you're kind of giving yourself that legitimacy of having the emperor back up your government, but the emperor is not really in charge of anything at all, and he's pretty much ineffectual, doesn't do anything other than deliver legitimacy to whoever's actually in charge of Vietnam. And, the French have not given up on this notion of keeping Vietnam as a colony in the French Empire. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French movement in Paris, and he was notorious for not warmongering, but, trying to convince national powers that France must maintain their holdings in Southeast Asia, namely the jewel of that being Indochina or Vietnam. And so the French, after being kicked around by the Japanese, they are going to send men back into Vietnam to sort of regain control there. But what's happened is you've had this period of time where, left to their own devices, Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh, under this new Democratic Republic of Vietnam, have kind of taken control and mobilized in a way that they hadn't been able to do before, when French secret police were playing whack-a-mole with different Communist Party members, with different Viet Minh members. I say those two things interchangeably. Bernard Fall writes about the time immediately after the Democratic Republic of Vietnam is declared and France decides to send men back into Vietnam. quote, "A French expeditionary force of less than 2 divisions was allowed to re-enter North Vietnam in February 1946 under the terms of an agreement negotiated by the French with the Viet Minh, which in the meantime had proclaimed a republic on September 2nd, 1945, and the Chinese nationalists. But the Viet Minh had about 10 months in which to establish their administration, train their forces with Japanese and American weapons and Japanese and Chinese instructors, and kill or terrorize into submission the genuine Vietnamese nationalists who wanted a Vietnam independent from France, but equally free of communist rule. The first round of the war for Indochina already had been lost for the West before it had even begun." Now, you got to take it with a grain of salt a little bit because Bernard Fall is writing from a distinctly French or Western perspective, and he's writing in 1964. So you don't really get, for him, the chance to get all the details that filter in later that later historians have been able to put together. But what you do get with Fall is this kind of immediacy to what's happening. And in a lot of ways, Bernard Fall gets to prognosticate about what will happen in the future. And it was said that when American soldiers went into Vietnam, they were carrying a lot of copies of books that Bernard Fall had written, namely Street Without Joy, which I just quoted. Nevertheless, the big shift has already sort of happened where in the vacuum, filling in the space that the Japanese have left, that the French colonialists have left, Ho Chi Minh and his new government now have the legitimacy of Bao Dai, that emperor figure. So they have that. They have the Nguyen dynasty backing them up. He's a high-ranking member of the government there in Hanoi. And Vo Nguyen Giap has started to establish a People's Army of Vietnam. So they are kind of gathering steam, and they've got the backing of the people after the famine in 1945. But like Bernard Fall said in his book Street Without Joy, the West seemed to have lost the war before it even really began. Now, it's at this point when Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic, the DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and France begin negotiating. And at the point when they start negotiating, Charles de Gaulle is in charge of France, and he's this hardliner, right-wing guy that is in favor of the French Empire. Very strong personality, a World War I, a World War II veteran. And de Gaulle, his power in France waxes and wanes. And this is just something I guess I noticed in the process of doing all the research, is that France can't keep the same government over and over. Like in the process of just this French Indochinese war, this first war in Vietnam, France has like 4 different governments. Well, the first one, and the one that Ho Chi Minh is trying to negotiate with, is led by Charles de Gaulle. And these negotiations get mired down and turned into this one long thing where neither side ends up giving concessions to the other one. What France wants, and they feel like they have the upper hand here. They feel like they're negotiating from a place of strength, which is, again, just amazing because clearly they have no concept of how things are going in Indochina. They've been pushed out. They have like a token force in Haiphong in the north, and then they've got some men in Cochin China and southern Annam in the south. But there's no organization. There's no structure to any of French control in Indochina. And in that space that we talked about where the Viet Minh were able to basically take over Vietnam, I mean, they effectively took over Vietnam, and they're running things, and they have kind of a stranglehold on all the different nationalist groups. They've formed their government. They've got the legitimacy. But there's this weird holding pattern where it seems like there's such an obvious disconnect between what the French feel like they have and what they actually have, what they think they've got and the reality of things on the ground. And then in the midst of all of this, Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese send 150,000 men down into Haiphong, kind of as a police force, if you can imagine, which made me chuckle when I was reading, just because how absurd is it that 150,000 men is a token police force? And the men that China sends down into North Vietnam, they're ragged, and there's reports of them just like eating Hanoi dry, essentially, taking up all the food and, of course, causing all sorts of a ruckus with the local women. And, you know, there's reports of rapes and things like this, like just all kinds of things, chaos that you'll find with a ragged, ill-provisioned army. And Chiang Kai-shek wants to use this force as a counterweight or a police force for everything that's happening in Vietnam. It's like, I'll send these men down here, and you're going to play along, and you're going to do your part, France, and you're going to do your part, Vietnam, because if you don't get it together, if you don't come to some sort of an accord, well, there's 150,000 men here ready to enforce order or something like that. In these negotiations, Charles de Gaulle and France wanted Ho Chi Minh's government to accept something like a puppet government. They didn't want to give them full independence, which is what obviously Vietnam's pushing for, but they were going to allow them self-government, but in sort of the colonialist view of what self-government could be. By that I mean, France at this point doesn't want to give up any power, and they feel like if they allow Vietnam self-government, it'll sort of pacify them. It'll just keep them quiet, and they'll be more malleable. But of course, when you're allowing a puppet state self-government, and you're a Western power, what are you really giving them? Not much. Time and time and time again, you see in history, you give a puppet state their own government, and you're just there as an advisor. You're just there as kind of like the distant hand guiding things along. But of course, you're not really a distant hand. You're not just an advisor. France wanted Vietnam pacified. They didn't want Vietnam independent. So they're going to give them, quote unquote, self-government, which doesn't actually do anything for them. It doesn't really change anything other than give them the illusion of freedom. And of course, Ho Chi Minh saw right through it. He knew exactly what kind of game the French were trying to play. You see over and over and over again that he's despairing because he sees no end in sight to the negotiations. Again, Ho Chi Minh at these negotiations is on his best behavior for the West, and in typical style, where you don't really know what sort of guy Ho Chi Minh is, you get these vignettes that people in the West have been able to report about him. And over and over and over again, they tend to say kind of the same thing. This from people who visited him at the negotiations at Fontainebleau. Visitors of Ho said, quote, "When you talk to him, he strikes you as quite above the ordinary run of mortals. Perhaps it is the spirit that great patriots are supposed to have. Surely he has that. Long struggling has left him mild and resigned, still sustaining some small idealism and hope that the war can be avoided. But I think it is particularly his kindliness, his simplicity, his down-to-earthness. I think Abraham Lincoln must have been such a man, calm, sane, and humble." Another said, quote, "I came away with the impression that I had been talking to a sincere patriot, though obviously imbued with all the characteristics of a convinced revolutionary. There's no doubt in my mind that he is prepared to go to any lengths to attain his object." End quote. On March 6th, Ho Chi Minh and the French government came to an accord. Paris nominally respected Vietnamese independence in this accord. And I say nominally because they didn't, but on paper they did. But as part of the accord, it allowed for French troops to gain access to the north. And part of the deal was French colons, French soldiers were going to enter Hanoi. France kind of gave legitimacy to the DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, as the sole government in Vietnam. So they recognized Ho Chi Minh's government as being legitimate. They sort of recognized Vietnam as being nominally independent, but I say that with heavy doses of air quotes, because the French didn't really believe Vietnam to be independent. Or if they did, they believed it in sort of a little brother racist sort of way, where it's like, yeah, Indochina's independent to govern themselves with heavy French influence involved. Maybe not the same sort of government that it used to be, where France was very obviously in control and ruled with a heavy hand, but I think people in France viewed this settlement as a foot in the door, a way to get back to the way things were. Part of the negotiations that I think sped this along was that Charles de Gaulle resigned as leader of France. With his resignation, things seemed to speed along because de Gaulle, he didn't necessarily resign because of issues in Indochina. He resigned because of issues at home where he felt like he couldn't gain any true support, and he was mired in issues in his own backyard, and he just left. He said, he washed his hands of it. He said, I've had enough. And the new government in Paris swiftly got to work and got a settlement negotiated with Indochina. Nothing else, to me, illustrates the new way forward for the French state in Indochina than the appointment of Thierry d'Argenlot. Of course, I'm horrendously mispronouncing the name, and I'm sure with a lot of these French names, I'm butchering them, and apologies to any French speakers out there for butchering your beautiful language, but I do what I can. D'Argenlot had this Carmelite monk training as part of his background between World War I and World War II. But then, once World War II broke out, he went and joined the French army, was captured by Germans, then released back. Just a very colorful man and a colorful background, and he seems like he's a very rigorous and stern Catholic individual. And what's so interesting about him is that he was a devoted de Gaulleist, as the followers of Charles de Gaulle were called, a hardliner in favor of the Free French agenda in Indochina. He was a guy who believed wholeheartedly in the French Empire, and he happened to be the guy in charge in Saigon when the March 6th Accords are made. From Embers of War, Frederick Logval talks about this interesting moment when the Accords have been made, but still there's this idea that France doesn't really want to change anything, or perhaps it's just d'Argenlot doesn't really want to change how things are done and wants to just continue as things have always been done, even though he's supposed to work with Vaux Nguyen Giap to kind of come to an agreement for how this new balance of power is going to work. From Embers of War, quote, "Little by little the Admiral," or d'Argenlot, "little by little the Admiral set about retracting the concessions France had made. In mid-April, in talks with Vaux Nguyen Giap at Dalat, a mountain resort known for its elegant villas and comparatively cool weather, he refused to discuss a provision in the March 6th Accords calling for joint Franco-Vietnamese efforts to end hostilities in the South, or to act on the matter of the referendum regarding whether Cochin China would reunite with the North. D'Argenlot and Giap also clashed on the future status of Vietnam as a free state. For Giap, the DRV's position in the French Union would be as an essentially sovereign state, but the Frenchman countered that the French Union was a federation, which meant that each free state within it must relinquish part of its sovereignty to the central authority, and specifically to the High Commissioner appointed in Paris. that is, himself. It's so emblematic of the entire French approach to Indochina, where they feel like that though they've, on paper, given Indochina, given Vietnam independence, given them sovereignty to govern themselves, they haven't really given them anything. It's this kind of farcical agreement that they've made where they're just keeping Vietnam peaceful, they're just appeasing them. And maybe it's just that D'Argenlou is a hardliner where he bought in totally to the de Gaulleist view of how Indo-Chinese policy should work. But he never believed that Indochina was going to gain any sort of independence, whether or not it was agreed upon on paper in Paris. So D'Argenlou sets up a puppet government in the south, in southern Annam and in Cochin, China. And he puts a guy named Nguyen Van Tin on the proverbial throne as the puppet leader for this southern anti-communist, pro-French Vietnamese government. Kind of as a way to do what the Japanese had done, to do what the DRV did with Ho Chi Minh and with Bao Dai. It's this same formula. You want to create support for the locals by having a local guy, a guy who looks like them, acts like them, talks like them, in charge. But of course, whoever you put in charge isn't actually in charge. And this Nguyen Van Tin quickly realized that he wasn't in charge of anything. And he committed suicide. I've often wondered how this situation might have changed if Thierry D'Argenlou just wasn't involved in the process in 1946. Because D'Argenlou is so antagonistic and so hardliner de Gaulle, so committed to the French Empire. If you would have had somebody that came in at like 70% the intensity of D'Argenlou, things might have turned out so different. And the change in French government from de Gaulle to the new guy, Leon Blum, seemed to open up an opportunity for D'Argenlou to kind of go rogue and do his own thing in Indochina. And Blum, the new guy in charge in Paris, seems fairly ineffectual in the events that take place over the next couple months in this story. Because D'Argenlou and his general Jean Valois came together and decided that they were going to put an end to unrest between the Vietnamese and the French once and for all. On November 20th, 1946, both French and Vietnamese ships got in a little tussle in the Haiphong Harbor. They were both claiming the right to inspect incoming ships and collect customs payments on ships coming into the harbor. As part of this, I guess, as a retaliatory thing, because the Vietnamese weren't allowing the French to collect customs, but the French weren't allowing the Vietnamese to do the same thing. The French confiscated some gasoline from a Vietnamese ship, and a scuffle broke out. Several people ended up being killed when gunfire broke out, and Vietnamese police had to come in and settle the situation. The two sides ended up agreeing to a ceasefire negotiations that night. But Valois, I guess seeing his opportunity, he ordered the local commander to take advantage of the situation. From Embers of War, Frederick Logval says, quote, Valois ordered the volatile local commander, Colonel Pierre-Louis Deb, a 46-year World War II veteran who harbored a deep dislike of the Vietnamese, to, quote, take maximum advantage of this incident in order to improve our position in Haiphong. It seems clear that we are facing premeditated aggression, carefully planned by the regular Vietnamese army, which seems no longer to be following its government's orders. The moment has arrived to teach a hard lesson to those who have so treacherously attacked us. By every possible means, you must take complete control of Haiphong and force the Vietnamese government and army into submission. So Deb, or Debay, again, I'm butchering the name, 1,000 pardons, he ordered the Vietnamese to withdraw from Haiphong, which of course they didn't do. And so Deb ordered a full military attack of the city of Haiphong, this time supported by artillery from ships in the harbor. From Embers of War again, quote, "At 10:05 a.m. it began, a prolonged naval and aerial bombardment that over 2 days reduced much of the Vietnamese and Chinese quarters of Haiphong to rubble. How many Vietnamese died has never been firmly established, but certainly the number is in the thousands. According to credible reports, civilians attempting to flee the town were strafed by Spitfires." A French officer, Henri Martin, said years later, quote, "When we visited Haiphong afterwards, all the Vietnamese neighborhoods were completely wiped out. There were dead buried under debris. It is difficult to know the exact figure, but the larger part of the city, it seemed, to us from what we saw, that is almost the entire Vietnamese part of the city had been destroyed." End quote. Valois never got official approval for the attack, but D'Argenlot in Paris sent a message back to Valois the next day, quote, "We will never retreat or surrender," end quote, which is just vague enough that you can infer that he supported Valois' approach to the Haiphong incident, as it would later be called. I've always found it interesting, atrocities like this, which is what the incident or massacre in Haiphong certainly is. It's an atrocity where civilians in their thousands died. I think the French put forward that only 300 civilians died, whereas Ho Chi Minh later would say that about 20,000 civilians had died. The number's probably somewhere in the middle, but certainly a lot of innocent people just minding their own business, going about their life, were killed by French artillery in the Haiphong incident. And I've always found it interesting that situations like this, they're called incidents. You look at the sack of Nanking by the Japanese. It was called the Nanking Incident. But of course, thousands of people were killed. And this situation with Haiphong, it's called an incident. It's almost like the historiography leading up to now about that situation is trying to minimize its impact. And I think in recent years, Haiphong massacre has been more in vogue as a way to describe the events of November 20th and November 21st. At this point, immediately after the Haiphong massacre, the U.S. dispatched Abbott Lowe Moffett to get the lay of the land. At this point, the U.S. hasn't fully committed to supporting either side in a war for Vietnam, but the Truman administration is kind of dipping their toes in the water, as it were, to see if they need to do anything about the situation in Southeast Asia. And essentially, which I find hilarious, Abbott Lowe Moffett basically says that Vietnam is run by communists and that he felt the French needed to have a presence in the area to keep it pacified. It seems like over and over and over again with this situation in Vietnam, we have the West looking at the situation but not understanding the big picture and reducing the situation almost to its basest level of truth and using that as, well, here's how things are. The Vietnamese are communists and the French are kind of the beacon of light for the West, keeping things in order. But the U.S. stayed as a mediating party at best, or just completely neutral at worst. And in a counterfactual, if you could look at how things might have changed at this point, immediately leading up to the Haiphong massacre and then immediately afterward, Ho Chi Minh is looking for a way out. He doesn't want war at all. He told a French reporter, quote, Neither France nor Vietnam can afford the luxury of a bloody war, end quote, and then added, the Vietnamese would endure an atrocious struggle, no matter how lengthy, rather than renounce their liberty, end quote. He's looking for a way out, and he goes to the Truman administration to see if they'll support the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the Truman administration turns them away. And you wonder in that moment how things might have changed had Harry Truman and the United States backed the Vietnamese. Obviously, the world stage would have probably looked quite a bit different. The French would, I'm sure, not have just taken that on the chin. But as is the nature with counterfactuals, you can't really play out all the different scenarios because you don't know how things might have changed, but certainly they would have. Fighting in Vietnam devolved into this melee that seems constant throughout Hanoi, Haiphong, and the surrounding areas, to the point where you can't exactly pinpoint exact military maneuvers so much as it's street fighting, it's guerrilla warfare, it's insurgency, and it's constant through a large swath of northern Vietnam. And weighing on a lot of minds abroad after the Haiphong massacre, the incident, whatever you want to call it, was this idea that the West had somehow made this massive mistake where you took the propaganda view of the Viet Minh, which had started to gain steam, that perhaps they were communist. And if they were communist, you associate them with a lot of the atrocities that tended to accompany communist governments in the past, namely Soviet Russia, and some of the atrocities that Russia had inflicted upon its own people. You think about Joseph Stalin with the quote that one life lost is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. That's the sort of idea that the West had of what communism brought to a government. And so when the West is confronted with this idea that perhaps the French are no better than the Viet Minh, questions abound. A correspondent in the London Times wrote, quote, "Any colonial power which puts itself in the position of meeting terrorism with terrorism might as well wash its hands of the whole business. We're about to see the French army reconquer the greater part of Indochina, only to make it impossible for any French merchant or planter to live there outside a barbed wire perimeter." You can start to see now where warfare has changed, and those guerrilla tactics that the Viet Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap have been developing are starting to be used. These ideas from Zedong, from Clausewitz, the idea of guerrilla warfare, of counterinsurgency, is coming to the fore after all the struggles in Haiphong and Hanoi. There's a road called Highway 5 from Haiphong to Hanoi, which came to be known as the Road of Blood, because over and over and over again, transports or caravans or groups of cars would travel up and down the road, and they'd be ambushed, and the people in the transports in the caravan would be killed. Bernard Fall writes in his book, Street Without Joy, about how counterinsurgency, how these ambushes were perceived before the First Indochina War, and then how they actually played out in reality. There was this idea that if you had a small convoy or a large convoy, it didn't really matter, that the enemy would put some sort of ambush at the front of your convoy. So you'd pull up, and there might be, the proverbial fallen log or something blocking the road. And then people would materialize out of the brush on either side of the road, and they would attack the front and the ends of the column. And so there were theories about how you could defend against such an attack. And the idea was that in the case of such an attack, people would disembark from the convoy, and they would arm themselves, and they would go to wherever the enemy is attacking the convoy, and they would deal with the issue as it arose, kind of thing. But in reality, what would happen is the entire road would be littered with booby traps and bombs, and the enemy wouldn't attack a specific part of the convoy. The Vietnamese would attack everywhere and in massive numbers, and it would be a quick hit and then run. And the effects of such attacks were devastating. Fall writes in Street Without Joy about this sort of ambush, quote, "This idea assumes that the enemy would A, always block the convoy from the front, and B, leave the flanks of the ambush area both unattacked and, above all, unmined and untrapped. Both assumptions, as this book has amply shown, are perfect nonsense. In Vietnam, the usual ritual is to blow up the lead vehicle through a teleguided mine so as to block the progress of the rest of the convoy, and to do the same to the rear guard so as to block all retreat. The ambush then usually develops along a stretch of road whose sides and ditches have been thoroughly mined or provided with caltraps, and the whole ambush area is well covered by enemy mortars, recoilless artillery, and machine guns. In most cases, secondary ambushes are laid for the rescue elements likely to come up from either the rear or ahead." End quote. I found a quote from a soldier who fought in the Korean War where they're fighting the Chinese troops, and the Chinese and Mao Zedong generated the idea of guerrilla warfare that Vo Nguyen Giap loved so much and adapted to his own Vietnamese army. So the same tactics that the Chinese were using against the United States and Korea were also being adapted and used against the French in Indochina. So you got a lot of similarities in how these ambushes would play out between the two wars. So here's a quote from a United States soldier that was ambushed by Chinese in Korea. Quote, "They mortared one of the tracks up ahead and they mortared one or two trucks at the back, effectively blocking the road at both ends. And then they just gradually closed in and quite a considerable number of our people got through. At the end, it was the last 20 trucks or so or something like that got caught. At first, we just stayed on the trucks and, well, there were a few bullets fizzing around and I presume there were a number of people hit. When the trucks finally ground to a halt, we were ordered off the trucks, and at both sides of this little road we were on was a small kind of monsoon ditch running up both sides. So we just got into this little ditch or trench on either side. You couldn't always see the enemy on a hillside. You occasionally saw them ducking from foxhole to foxhole, but there weren't sort of masses of them. It was all just a very confused and chaotic situation." That is textbook, the way that the West thought you would deal with these ambushes. You'd disembark from your trucks and you would try and establish a position on either side of the road and then deal with the enemy piecemeal and then kind of reclaim the convoy from there. But obviously we see from Bernard Fall's examination of these things that it didn't quite happen like that. The enemy would come in from all different parts of the convoy, and it wouldn't just be that they would attack the front and the ends. Yes, they would bomb the front and the ends, but then it would just be this chaotic situation like what the soldier said. And they would just try and sow havoc, blow up as much as they could, kill as many people as they could, and then melt away into the forest. So again, you get this idea that the French coming in don't fully grasp how the Vietnamese operate. They don't understand what the Vietnamese seem to understand about guerrilla warfare, that these are not just some country fools that aren't educated, that don't know how to conduct military operations. Giap is putting together a functioning military. And on top of that, this military is arming themselves creatively. They're stealing weapons from convoys that the French have going up and down Highway 5 and other roads. They're ambushing, stealing things. They gathered weapons from the Japanese. When the Japanese used to be there, they would raid depots, supply depots that the Japanese had. They're getting weapons from the Chinese, from the Soviets. They're also stealing American weapons that have funneled in from Korea. And so this idea that it's just a police force, you can go in there, you can throw a few guys at it, and it'll take care of itself. It seems like it's not working. And fighting in Vietnam devolves into this constant melee where you have convoys getting raided, you kill a few people, you blow some stuff up, you steal the weapons, and then you melt away into the brush. And this happens over and over and over again. And as a result of this type of fighting, the French start to fight fire with fire. From Max Hastings' book, Vietnam, he says about the way fighting devolved, quote, "The two sides competed in ruthlessness. The Viet Minh executed village chiefs who declined to bow to their will, often by live burial before peasant audiences, after subjecting them to tortures of medieval ingenuity. When the Viet Minh killed one Vietnamese soldier captured in French service, a guerrilla borrowed a pair of pliers from a nearby house with which he removed the man's gold fillings. A child witness wrote, quote, now quoting the child witness, "I had seen many corpses beheaded, dismembered, eviscerated, even scalped, yet nothing more disgusting than the sight of that guerrilla holding the 2 gold teeth, his face beaming." End quote. And then on the French side, they weren't a whole lot different. Hastings writes about an incident where French were flying in a helicopter and they witness a wisp of smoke curling up from a hamlet. And he quotes a French legionnaire who said, quote, "Beneath our eyes, violence was being done, but we were as detached from it almost as from history. One could understand what an aid to untroubled killing the bombing plane must be." End quote. Another incident is related by Bob Miller of the United Press, who was aboard a French armored barge patrolling a canal. He says, and this is from Max Hastings again, quote, "Bob Miller of the United Press was aboard a French armored barge patrolling a canal late one night when its searchlight fixed upon 3 sampans breaching the curfew. 2 that ignored an order to halt were riddled with machine gun fire. The third contained 2 elderly peasants and their son with a cargo of rice. The sacks were duly tipped overboard, whereupon the boy sought to escape by leaping into the water. A soldier tossed a grenade in his wake, killing him. A courteous young French officer explained to Miller that, quote, that it was only by making people understand that breaches of the regulations would be punished with extreme severity that the French could hope to keep the upper hand, end quote. It was probably a long time in coming, but the French slowly lost the moral high ground that they felt they had. First, it was just the fraught idea of empire, which FDR waged war against, and America probably would have fought harder against had Harry Truman not been the president and had he not been so preoccupied with Japan, and then kind of turned a blind eye to everything that happened in Southeast Asia after 1945. I think it's worth noting that the Viet Minh behaved poorly at times, executing village chiefs and generally kind of raining terror on the countryside to get people on board. You know, they're trying to win hearts and minds, and they'll do that, and they'll take willing service. But at the same time, the Viet Minh are conducting this operation of terror on the countryside. There was a saying that if a Vietnamese was caught wearing blue pants and a white shirt, that they were assuredly a French spy and could be subject to execution. Their family could be shot. There was also this idea, like what I've said before, where the family is kind of the central unit. And so if one member of the family is found to be a spy or to be conducting themselves in a way that might be sympathetic to the French, the whole family might be murdered. And 2, the army, the people that made up the People's Army for the Viet Minh were, according to Max Hastings, quote, simple men whose worldview was formed entirely by their own and their family's immediate experience, colored by oppression and hardship over generations. If you were somebody who had a primary school diploma or had gone, grades 1 through 12 equivalent here, you were considered an intellectual, which meant that your safety was not assured. And 2, the Viet Minh are running around conducting summary executions of anybody who was sympathetic to the French or just French soldiers that happened to be in the area. One incident goes as such, according to Max Hastings in his book Vietnam, quote, one peasant retained an indelible childhood memory of the Viet Minh visiting his northern village in 1952, seizing 2 unarmed soldiers in French service who had called to wish friends a Happy New Year and beheading them behind his family's house. This 12-year-old said later, quote, now quoting the 12-year-old, I can still hear the sound of their necks being cut through, end quote. Then the guerrillas left and French troops arrived. They accused neighbors of responsibility for the man's deaths and burned every surrounding house. End quote. Another incident is recounted that in 1953, quote, from, again, Max Hastings, the Viet Minh sentenced the child, this same child that recounted the instance before in 1952, the Viet Minh sentenced the child to spend 2 weeks in a re-education camp conducting self-criticism, quoting the child. Everything that I did wrong or my parents or grandparents did wrong had to be written down. Everybody had to think hard what to write, end quote. Just put yourself in that situation. If you're a 13-year-old Vietnamese boy and you're in a re-education camp and somebody's in a military uniform standing over you, they've perhaps killed your family or maybe not. Maybe they weren't even there. They're just the sergeant or the guy running the re-education camp. And he's looking down over your shoulder at this piece of paper that you're supposed to be writing down every single act that your father, that your grandfather will have committed that is considered wrong, that's considered, a crime against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And you're 13 years old. I mean, just try and wrap your brain around that. And the simple quote that the kid gives is, everybody had to think really hard about what to write. You're making stuff up at that point. You're trying to come up with anything that will just, get them to leave you alone, to send you back home. Like, imagine that. You're sitting there and you're like, oh, let's see here. What did Dad do that was so bad? Well, he went to school as a kid. That's, check mark against, that's bad. Can't do that. We've held this piece of land for 3 generations. Oh, that's not good either. That's taking part in the colonialism. Or maybe you got the land from the French. Oh, that's real bad. You can't do that. Maybe your grandfather stole, a piece of rice 30 years ago, and it's recounted around the fire at family dinners. Oh, that's bad. You got to write that one down. Imagine the things that these kids are coming up with. And this is one example of many. Another common occurrence was the Viet Minh coming in and conducting land redistribution reforms, as they might call them. But they'd come into a local hamlet and, you'd come up to the head of a family. You'd be like, okay, this land that you've had in your family for fill in the blank number of generations, there's no telling. We're going to chop it up and you get to keep this little piece right here. But this other piece that has been your land but now isn't is going to go back to the government, and the government is going to do with it as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam sees fit. And if you resisted, you were liable to end up in a re-education camp like what that little boy experienced, where you will have to write down all the wrongs that your family has committed going back like 3 generations. You'd have to profess love to Ho Chi Minh, to Joseph Stalin, to Lenin. Or you might just be killed. They might just bury you alive. There's one instance I remember reading where the Viet Minh came in and there was a dissenter who wasn't going to give up his land, and so they killed him. But instead of shooting him, which is what he begged for, he said, please give me the mercy of shooting me. And they said, and the quote was something along the lines of, we're saving all our bullets for the French. And they hacked his head off. Things like this are happening constantly, and when the people are caught in this weird catch-22 where you can't win. The Viet Minh are coming in and taking your land and sort of compelling you to contribute to the cause, taking your rice stores, taking your young men to fight in the People's Army. Sometimes you would get willing service, but sometimes you wouldn't. And if you didn't come willingly, they'd force you into it or they'd kill you. Or if the Viet Minh came in and, like in that previous example, killed French soldiers that were just passing through, the French would come back in later and then burn the whole village down. And so villagers are caught in between the 2 armies. And it's a wonder that the Viet Minh ever generated any popular support at all. And I've wondered that often when reading for this. Like, how on earth were the Viet Minh able to generate any popular support at all. And it says so much about the French, in my mind, that they were able to do that. Granted, the local peasants have no concept of the outside world. They are only able to understand what their immediate experience tells them. And their immediate experience is that of Viet Minh operators and cadres coming in to their hamlet and saying, the French are colonialists and they hate you because of the color of your skin. And, we want to win back Vietnam and take back our country so that we can have the right to govern ourselves. And that, I'm sure, played well, but also at the same time, if you're not buying in, if you're not supporting the cause, you're likely to get sent to a re-education camp. You're likely to see one of your family members killed. You're likely to find yourself killed. And then on the flip side, if you're helping the Viet Minh out, the French might kill you as well. So you're stuck where there's a no-win situation. One of my, I think, greatest takeaways is just how much of a tragedy this would be to live there. I try to put myself in the shoes of a peasant living there, and obviously I can't because I've never remotely experienced what that would be like, but it just is, it boggles the mind. The war in Vietnam devolved into a little attack here, a little attack there, just like Ho Chi Minh said it would. The tiger jumping on the elephant, tearing away pieces of flesh, and then immediately melting away into the jungle. A little bit here, a little bit there. And stage one of guerrilla warfare was to wear the French out. And it was working. The beauty of counterfactuals is that you can look at history through the lens of, well, what might have happened if this thing might have happened, or if this major event might have gone a little bit differently. Obviously, you can't really know the full extent of how things might have changed if you're looking at counterfactuals, but what you can do is kind of tickle that curiosity maybe, where you see, okay, this major event changed things this way, but what if it had gone slightly to the left or to the right, and how would that have affected everything? One of the maybe coolest counterfactuals is, what if at the outset of the French Indochina War, the French had actually killed Ho Chi Minh? Because there is an operation that takes place where Jean Valois, again, I'm butchering the name, of many apologies. There's an operation where the French say, what if we can take out Ho Chi Minh? What if we can take out Ho Chi Minh, Vo Nguyen Giap, Pham Van Dong, the whole nine, get rid of the entire leadership of the Viet Minh in one fell swoop? That's exactly what Jean Valois tries to do at the outset of Operation Lee. Bernard Fall, in his book Street Without Joy, writes about the stakes and why Valois might extend himself the way he did with Operation Lee. He says, quote, "Lee would have been a hazardous undertaking under any circumstances. In the Indochina of 1947, it was, furthermore, a wild gamble at finishing the whole war in one single master stroke. There were two reasons for this. At home, the French legislature was beginning to balk at the cost of the Indochina War, and the French government had promised it to reduce the French forces there from 115,000 down to 90,000 men. And also, a small rebellion had broken out in the Texas-sized island of Madagascar off the east coast of Africa, and 15,000 French troops were urgently needed there. Thus, the French High Command felt compelled to use all its available reserves before they would be withdrawn altogether. The nuts and bolts of the operation were simple. It was going to be an attempted pincer movement where they were going to provide an airborne half brigade, a main infantry force supplied with sappers as well, some engineers, and then a shipborne operation as well. And the idea was to catch the Viet Minh leadership in their headquarters by surprise and take them all out all in one fell swoop. So the plan is kind of this overextension by Valois and the French to win the whole thing at a stroke because, well, they don't know how much longer the war can go on. And it sort of plays into this idea that the French government thought that they could just clear out the Viet Minh and it would just be this quick little thing, this simple rebellion that we'll take out, and it won't take very long, i.e., that quote from Fontainebleau where the French said to Ho Chi Minh that they could just send a police force and clear the Viet Minh out. But if you're able to kind of clear all the pieces off the chessboard early on, then obviously the war is much, much quicker. The issue, though, was that it didn't all go according to plan. Surprise, surprise, things like this seem to never really do so, do they? Frederick Logval writes about how Operation Lee went off. He says here, quote, "Immediately, there were problems. Valai's plan called for a concentric attack involving airborne, amphibious, and overland columns. But the key initial phase, involving the dropping of paratroops near the Viet Minh headquarters at Bac Can, foundered on the inability to get troops in place quickly enough. It took 3 trips and many hours to get a mere 950 parachutists into the target area, forfeiting the advantages of surprise. Even then, Viet Minh leaders were initially caught flat-footed and suffered heavy casualties." End quote. So the plan sort of works. You get into headquarters and you deal the DRV a massive blow in terms of manpower loss, but you don't actually achieve the end goal here. Vo Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh escape. In fact, there's even some writing about that they got into the DRV headquarters and Ho Chi Minh still had some documents on his desk sitting there waiting for him to sign that he was apparently about to sign before they whisked him away. And then Vo Nguyen Giap started to get together his army and they essentially beat back the operation. And it turns into this where the French thought that they could get this decisive pincer movement that would happen quickly. It turns into this, again, guerrilla warfare, where it turns into fighting over bridges, roads, it's ambushes, it's bombs going off, and the whole thing just kind of settles and doesn't actually continue so much as it turns into the men of Operation Lee fighting for the ground that they've taken, but then slowly but surely they're pushed back, and it kind of turns into this operation of attrition. So Valai, trying to cover up his losses, he launches another operation to squeeze the Viet Minh soldiers into this contained area where they could essentially butcher them, but then that doesn't work. Again, it gets mired in bombings, blown bridges, road ambushes, and things like this, and so the French have to pull back. The French claim that they killed 9,000 Viet Minh soldiers in the process, but ultimately the operation was a failure because there was no real marked goal that had been achieved. It ended up working in Vo Nguyen Giap's favor because it just played into the whole idea of guerrilla warfare, right? You strike at the Viet Minh, but then because you don't achieve your goal, it turns into this war of attrition, which is exactly what Vo Nguyen Giap wanted. It's after Operation Lee that Vo Nguyen Giap starts to kind of put together the plans for how this war is going to go. At this point, it's been small fighting up and down all through Vietnam, but there hasn't been anything decisive. The French want to bring the war to a decisive battle. Giap does not. But with the People's Army that Giap has put together starting to gain some strength, he looks around and says, okay, we can start to conduct some operations of our own. Giap wrote about how he planned the war would go. He says, quote, "The enemy will pass slowly from the offensive to the defensive. The blitzkrieg will transform itself into a war of long duration. Thus, the enemy will be caught in a dilemma. He has to drag out the war in order to win it and does not possess, on the other hand, the psychological and political means to fight a long, drawn-out war." End quote. He says also in his own writings that, quote, We shall go on the general counteroffensive when the following conditions have been fulfilled. 1. Superiority of our forces over those of the enemy. 2. The international situation is in our favor. 3. The military situation is in our favor. We will have to receive aid from abroad in order to be able to carry out the counteroffensive, but to count solely upon it without taking into account our own capabilities is to show proof of subjectivism and of a lack of political conscience. But on the other hand, we cannot deny the importance of such aid. When we shall have reached the third stage, the following tactical principles will be applied. Mobile warfare will become the principal activity. Positional warfare and guerrilla warfare will become secondary." End quote. The target for Vaughn Giap was, in the fall of 1950, a string of French forts along the Chinese border. And the French thought that this was going to be fairly defensible. They had 10,000 men spread throughout these forts. But the problem was the distance between all the different forts was so great that it was virtually indefensible. And not only that, Vaughn Giap had probably between a 3-to-1 and an 8-to-1 numbers difference. They'd been receiving aid from the Soviets, from the Chinese, and this had gone and evolved from an army that was on a shoestring budget with hardly enough guns for each man to hold a gun to now they're well supplied. They had Soviet and Chinese weapons, and the force had sort of ballooned to about 200,000 men. For this operation, Giap commits maybe 70 to 80,000 men. Bernard Fall writes about this evolution of the Viet Minh Army, quote, "Soon, Viet Minh battalions began to appear in full field formations, equipped with heavy mortars and pack howitzers, followed shortly thereafter by complete artillery battalions using American-made recoilless rifles and 105mm howitzers. After nearly a year of relentless training, Giap, the communist commander, felt that his newly forged tool was ready for the first direct showdown with the French." So his target is this string of forts, and the French, instead of kind of digging in and defending the forts, they retreat. And it begins this debacle. The French probably could have held in these different forts and held for a while individually and made it such that the Viet Minh would have to spend a ton of time and resources taking all these forts. And probably they would have. They had such a numbers disparity that if given enough time, they would have probably taken the forts anyway. But instead of forcing Giap's hand, instead of forcing him to commit to a battle and commit more resources than he wanted to do, they just retreated. They left the base at Lang Son and at Cao Bang. And in warfare, it's the retreat where all the disasters happen, right? If you're fighting in close quarters, it turns into this long deal where you force a war of attrition upon the Viet Minh. But once you retreat and you start running into the jungle, a place that you don't know, a place that the Viet Minh know better than you, and you allow them to set up ambushes for your men, and you string out your supply to where it turns into this, you're lucky if you get out alive kind of thing. If you turn it into that, you're playing into Giap's hands. And that's exactly what happened with this debacle on the Chinese border. The French headquarters in the south of Vietnam ordered that one contingent of the French should try and go meet up with the other contingent of the French, and they said to, burn the vehicles, destroy your big guns, and go meet up and join with this other contingent of French soldiers, and then that way you can kind of hunker down and fight the Viet Minh. The problem was, on its face, the orders are completely stupid. You're getting rid of all of your defensive weapons and your vehicles, your ability to move quickly. You're destroying that, and you're then going to go on foot in the jungle to go meet up with another set of French soldiers. Max Hastings writes about this catastrophe, quote, "Marchers soon began to fall out and vanish, never to be seen again. A man wounded was a man fated to die. Each climb and descent was agony for heavily laden infantry, drenched by rain that also denied them air support. The Viet Minh were weary too after days of strife and pursuit, but they enjoyed the peerless thrill of winning. They knew the French were in desperate straits. Giap issued an exultant October 6th order of the day, quote, "The enemy is hungrier and colder than you." The two columns met the next day, both of them shrunken by losses and lacking water, food, and ammunition. Then the Viet Minh struck again, 15 battalions pouring fire into their exhausted enemies. Their commanders ordered a dispersal into small parties. One of the leaders was wounded and taken prisoner. Most of the other fugitives were killed piecemeal. Just 600 men eventually reached French positions farther south. Some 4,800 were listed as dead or missing, while material losses were immense. 450 trucks, 8,000 rifles, 950 automatic weapons, and 100 mortars. End quote. This debacle in the north of Vietnam, in Tonkin, was completely debilitating for the French, trying to justify staying in Indochina and continuing on this war. It seemed the cost was so high, and they just cut the French some slack, I guess. They just didn't really understand what was needed for the job. And they had committed what they thought was an enormous amount of resources to the job. They had about 100,000 French troops in Indochina, but it's spread out all through the country, and the Viet Minh are concentrated in the north, and the Viet Minh also have this haven from the Chinese where they can just go up across the border into China. They can train their troops. They're getting outfitted and equipped by Chinese and Soviet weapons and gear, and their generals are getting trained by Chinese communist generals. There's basically a advisor for every single battalion, for every single division in the People's Army of Vietnam. And the numbers, the ranks are swelling. And not only that, they're starting to address the supply problem. There's something like 9,000 porters for this army, and they're able to move where they need to be. So Viet Minh operations are starting to become really formidable, just as the French are looking around and despairing at the situation. Pierre Mendès France said of the situation at one point, quote, "Things cannot continue like this. There are only two solutions. The first consists in realizing our objectives in Indochina by means of military force. If we choose that, let us at least avoid illusions and pious lies. To achieve decisive military successes rapidly, we need 3 times as many troops in the field and a tripling of appropriations, and we need them very quickly. The military solution is a massive new effort, sufficiently massive and sufficiently rapid to anticipate the already considerable development of the forces opposed to us." One of the solutions in 1948 that the French rolled out was this same game plan that the Japanese and the Viet Minh before them had used. It was bringing out the keeper of greatness, that ineffectual emperor, the heir to the Nguyen dynasty, the official emperor of Indochina, of Vietnam, Bao Dai. Diogen Lu set up a government for Bao Dai, and I guess the concept or the end goal here is twofold. You're trying to generate some popular support behind Bao Dai as the official emperor of French-held southern Vietnam, but you're also trying to go to other countries like the United States and say, hey, look, this isn't a French colonial government running things here in Vietnam. It's actually Bao Dai. See, we set up a government here. He's the emperor of Vietnam. He's the guy in charge here. The French are just advisors, right? We're the distant hand kind of guiding Bao Dai as he governs southern Vietnam. Now, if you could look under the guise or behind the curtain and see what's actually happening, you'd realize that Bao Dai isn't doing anything. He's not running things at all. Thierry Diogen Lu is. France is. Bao Dai is just the same as he was for the Japanese. He's a puppet. He's a guy that the French feel is very malleable, that they can, manipulate and get him to do what needs to be done so that the French can not change anything, but by all appearances look like they've changed everything, if that makes any sense. And I would love to have a conversation with somebody who was there, who could witness what this actually was like on the ground in the moment? Because it seems like the definition of insanity to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. And I guess by establishing a Bao Dai-led government, you have to wonder what the expected result was. Is the expected result that you would generate this wave of popular support and then the French would ride this wave and use it as a base with which they could defeat the Viet Minh? Surely they wouldn't have been opposed to a situation like that, but is that the end goal? Or is the end goal just to keep the public somewhat mollified by putting Bao Dai on a puppet throne? And if that's the goal, it says a lot about the French not understanding how things really worked, because the peasants, the people living in rural areas, which also happen to be the base for a lot of Viet Minh operations, they have no concept of, higher politics. Bao Dai is just another face in a rotating set of faces that have governed or been in control of Vietnam. And, it wouldn't mean anything to anybody living in the moment that Bao Dai is set up as a puppet emperor. It wouldn't change anything. To peasants living there at the time, it would just seem like the French are still in control, because they were. And, nothing really changed. The only change is perception abroad in the West, because now France can market their governing solution in Indochina maybe a bit better. It doesn't sound so colonial. It's not a French colonial government. It's a local government. It kind of follows that FDR idea of trusteeship a little bit, maybe in vague shades. Crap hit the fan, though, for the French when the now Mao Zedong-led Communist People's Republic of China backed the Ho Chi Minh government, and then immediately after that, the Soviets backed Ho Chi Minh's government. Vietnam, in 1950, officially becomes like a proxy for international disputes everywhere else. France now kind of developed a trump card with the U.S. in Washington. The United States had stayed out of the conflict so far. The Truman administration was very happy just sort of leaving the French to it. But then once the Soviets and the Chinese pledged support for Ho Chi Minh's government, France had what it wanted. The French Foreign Ministry Secretary Alexandre Parodi said at one point to the American ambassador David Bruce, quote, "My country might cut her losses," end quote. And then American Secretary of State Dean Acheson said at one point, quote, "The thing we want to be careful about is that we do not press the French to the point where they say, all right, take over the damn country, you don't want it, and put their soldiers on ships and send them back to France," end quote. For the United States, they're sort of juggling the Southeast Asia issue as well as the French government, because while the French, I think, were at this point viewed as little brother in terms of international policy making, they were the boots on the ground in terms of keeping Southeast Asia stable. The British didn't want to devote troops to defending their colonies out in Southeast Asia, and the United States definitely didn't want to devote troops to it. So the French were the boots on the ground, and the French had to be, on the one hand, appeased, but on the other hand, the French had to maintain their hold on Southeast Asia because the Soviets and the Chinese could not win in Southeast Asia. It was at this point that the domino theory kind of became in vogue when people were thinking about Southeast Asia. And it seems so foolish now because it lumps Southeast Asia into just this one block where you don't give them any individuality to say that, well, if Indochina goes communist, then of course Cambodia is going to go communist, then Laos is going to go communist, then India is going to go communist, and all of a sudden you're going to get down and Australia is going to become communist next. I mean, it is this idea that if you lose in Indochina, if you lose in Vietnam, and they go communist, everything else is going to go communist, because once Mao Zedong took over in China, there was just this fear, I guess, that, well, the communists, they've had Russia, now they got China, And there's this communist government in Vietnam, and sure enough, it's just going to go boom, 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 boom. All the bowling pins will fall over, and we're going to look up in 5 years, and all of Asia is communist, and it's going to turn into this, East versus West thing, and we're going to have another world war. Knowing what we know now, it seems stupid to just reduce everything to a simple, polarity, a black and white reality, when obviously the real world is colored in grays. But I went and found online the U.S. National Security Council's plan, I guess, for Southeast Asia. It illustrates how the U.S. viewed policy before they actually got involved in Southeast Asia. But this from the brief that the U.S. National Security Council put together for their plan for Vietnam. Quote, "Such is the interrelation of the countries of the area that effective counteraction would be immediately necessary to prevent the loss of any single country from leading to submission to or in alignment with communism by the remaining countries of Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Furthermore, in the event of all Southeast Asia falls under communism, an alignment with communism of India and in the longer term of the Middle East could follow progressively. Such widespread alignment would seriously endanger the stability and security of Europe. Communist control of all Southeast Asia and Indonesia would threaten the U.S. position in the Pacific offshore island chain and would seriously jeopardize fundamental U.S. security interests in the Far East. The loss of Southeast Asia would have serious economic consequences for many nations of the free world and conversely would add significant resources to the Soviet bloc. Southeast Asia, especially Malaya and Indonesia, is the principal world source of natural rubber and tin, and a producer of petroleum and other strategically important commodities. The rice exports of Burma, Indochina, and Thailand are critically important to Malaya, Ceylon, and Hong Kong, and are of considerable significance to Japan and India, all important areas of free Asia. Furthermore, this area has an important potential as a market for the industrialized countries of the free world. The loss of Southeast Asia, especially of Malaya and Indonesia, could result in such economic and political pressures in Japan as to make it extremely difficult to prevent Japan's eventual accommodation to communism. The danger of an overt military attack against Southeast Asia is inherent in the existence of a hostile and aggressive communist China. The use of U.S. forces to oppose such an attack would require diversion of military strength from other areas, thus reducing our military capability in those areas, as well as overall with the recognized military risks involved therein, or an increase in our military forces in being or both. Toward deterring such an attack, the U.S. government has engaged in consultations with France and the United Kingdom on the desirability of issuing to Communist China a joint warning as to the consequences to Communist China of aggression in Southeast Asia. Although these consultations have not achieved a full measure of agreement, a warning to Communist China has in fact been issued, particularly as to Indochina, in a number of public statements." End quote. Perhaps another body blow in this heavyweight fight in Southeast Asia was the Allied choice to rearm West Germany. Again, it is an effort to deal with the communist problem. A further extension of the domino theory was that if East Germany went full communist and then invaded West Germany and all of Germany once again became communist, it was again a couple more steps toward world war. The new French Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès France, so aptly named, in fact, several times when I'm reading books, you see Mendès France's name come up and you're like, wait a minute, are we talking about the country or the guy? Well, in this case, you're talking about the guy. Anyways, Mendès France is looking around in 1950 and he goes, wait a minute, France is the wall against West Germany, and we're also contributing massive resources to Indochina. So the two major fronts in the East versus West, communism versus non-communism war of ideology that's happening right now, France is fighting on both fronts. And Mendès France starts looking around and he goes, hey, we need help. We can't do this on our own. We're just going to give up. And that is the bargaining chip that finally gets the U.S. involved because the U.S. realized they could no longer stand by and allow France to just quit Indochina. France needed resources back home in France in case Germany went full communist, in case a war broke out there. So they couldn't have all their resources devoted to their Indochinese colony. But at the same time, the U.S. realized, okay, we got to step in. And so in 1950, after a couple months of deliberation, the U.S. formally backed the South Vietnamese Bao Dai government. Notice they didn't back the French specifically, of course. That is exactly what it meant, underhanded, under the table. But officially, they backed the Vietnamese Bao Dai government. So in 1950, the French assigned a new general and high commissioner to Indochina. They assign a man named Jean de Lattre. De Lattre is a formidable figure. In fact, he is so much more formidable than any other French leader that has been in Indochina so far. He's a World War II legend, one of the premier generals that the French had during World War II. And he's often equated to sort of like a Douglas MacArthur kind of personality, an enigmatic, domineering force of nature kind of human being. Frederick Logval writes about him, quote, "De Lattre's temperament was the stuff of legend. Like Douglas MacArthur, to whom he bore a strong physical resemblance and was often compared, he could be impatient with his superior's instructions. Like MacArthur, he was vain and had a flair for the intensely dramatic. General de Theatre, some called him. More than one observer compared him to Churchill for his singular ability to dominate any room he entered, to attract all attention to himself, and to keep listeners enthralled with his magnetism, his self-deprecating wit, and his eloquence." He continues, "But there was also a dark side. Egocentric to the point of megalomania, De Lattre was prone to moodiness and to volcanic expressions of anger toward underlings. Meticulous in his personal experience, he wore uniforms tailored by Lanvin, the stylish Paris courtier, and he demanded that subordinates be likewise, and he bristled when on inspections his hosts failed to welcome him with the ceremonial he considered his due. Hence, they would call him King Jean." End quote. There's also a story that Logval tells about how De Lattre is so intense about his own honor, about his own country's honor, that he relates a story from World War II at a dinner for Allied commanders. He says, quote, "On one occasion during a dinner for Allied commanders, De Lattre refused to touch his food and wine because Marshal Zhukov of the Red Army neglected to mention France in a toast praising Allied armies. Informed of his mistake, Zhukov offered a separate toast to France. A mollified De Lattre began to eat and drink." So he's now one in a line of many of these charismatic, opinionated, domineering force sort of characters in charge of Indochina. But De Lattre has more of a force of will and a singular focus on what must need to be done that's not necessarily so ideological or political or even racist as some of the other guys in charge here, like Valai or D'Argenlou. He's focused exclusively on military operations, much less the political. Now, the political is incredibly important, and De Lattre does a lot for the political side of things, but he realizes first and foremost that you've got to start winning in the field in order to feed into how the politics are involved with Indochina as well. 1951 comes around, and Giap and Viet Minh officials start to wonder if the conditions had been met for them to go on the general offensive, to take the fight further south and actually give the set-piece battle to the French that the French had been so badly wanting. But there was one single thing that I think led to Giap's success in his initial forays into the Chinese border. It was that there was enough rain that it prevented the French from actually using air power. At the time, I think from those operations, Giap felt that he had what was needed to actually go on the offensive in order to take it to the French. They had beaten them and rebuffed basically the everything but the kitchen sink Operation Lee, and then had taken the fight back to them and won. And he had sort of shown that if you have, the necessary numbers and the necessary advantage in terrain and things like this, you could push the French further south. And so he starts looking further south at the outset of the campaign season in 1951. And Giap has this confidence about him. He's like, okay, I think we can do this now. The army has swelled to like 250,000 men. It is fairly well supplied. It's got, those American recoilless rifles, and it's got big guns from the Russians, and it's got small arms from the Chinese and Chinese advisors. It's looking like a pretty decent outfit. So Giap turns his gaze toward the Red River Delta. He overlooked a few things that had happened in the border campaign where he went up to the Chinese border and cleaned out those French forts. Namely, there's the air superiority part of it. The French had the air that the Vietnamese, they didn't have any air force or anything like that. So he overlooked that because the French were not able to launch planes and actually do anything from the air. He sort of overlooked that piece of it, but also the French were really spread out in that border campaign, and they weren't able to communicate with one another, and they weren't able to get from one place to another, whereas the Viet Minh were able to move relatively quickly from place to place, and he was able to move his units within that general battle area significantly better than the French were able to. But in the Red River Delta, the French were in a much better position strategically. Frederick Logval writes about this position, quote, "Here the French were much better placed. While the Viet Minh forces moved into position north of Hanoi, 65 infantry, 12 artillery, and 8 engineer battalions from the 308th and the 312th divisions, together with civilian porters who brought 5,000 tons of rice, ammunition, and weapons, Viet Minh propagandists began posting leaflets around the Delta bearing the inscription, Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi for Tet, essentially saying that they would have taken over Hanoi by Tet, which is the Chinese Lunar New Year, which is in February. He continues, French commanders girded for battle and their intelligence analysts identified the general whereabouts of the enemy's concentration and the probable attack date. The first target in what would become known as the Day River battles was Vinh Yen, some 30 miles northwest of Hanoi on the north side of the Red River, near where it debouched from the highlands. The town was one of Hanoi's protective bastions. If it fell, the road to the capital would be open. Giap planned to use his 2 divisions to breach Vinh Yen's defenses and force a gap, through which his forces could make a dash for Hanoi. De Lattre sent North African troops to secure the heights around Vinh Yen, and Giap kind of dashed in and took out some smaller outposts around Vinh Yen and then made his dash toward the battlefield itself. And the thing that changed here was that De Lattre really utilized an aerial bombardment the way it had not been used before. And the French got their first look at what would be a staple of the Vietnamese style of fighting was these human wave attacks. I try to put myself in the perspective of a French soldier fighting in a battle like this, where you have wave upon wave upon wave of Vietnamese soldiers running at you, and the casualties are piling up and they're dying left and right, and they just keep coming over and over and over again. And that's something that you would think would have like a negative effect on Giap's ability to maintain command of the army, but it was kind of baked in to the whole philosophy of the war for the Viet Minh that people were going to die, and a lot of them were going to die, and it just didn't matter. Ho Chi Minh had said he would wage total war, which meant that as long as any revolutionary was still alive, the war was still on. And it meant that you could waste all the human capital in your army as long as at the end of it you still had an achieved goal to show for it. And so the life cost of your soldiers dying didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It kind of boggles the Western mind a little bit because Western armies always tend to protect the lives of those fighting in the battle. It's thrown around a lot that in the American war in Vietnam, 58,000 U.S. soldiers died. And it was, it was a terrible war, and the loss was significant, and it was kind of the black spot on the U.S.'s military history. But it was at the loss of 58,000 men, which it seems like a lot if you think about it, but when you look at how much the North Vietnamese lost and how many civilians died, it pales in comparison. I think the running numbers is between 2 and 3 million civilians died, and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese soldiers died. So it's this East meets West kind of thing where the styles of fighting are so drastically different that you end up in situations where you've got French soldiers fighting against Vietnamese soldiers, and the Vietnamese are just coming in wave after wave after wave after wave. I think what makes stories like this one sort of come alive for me is when you can put yourself in a situation and try and imagine what it might have been like if you were there, reacting humanly to the things happening to you in a moment like this, in a battle situation like this. What would I have done if I were facing a human wave attack? If you see a sea of humanity swarming towards you and you're emptying machine gun and artillery fire into them, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could think about that. I went and looked up a few different accounts, eyewitness accounts of human wave attacks, of dealing with them on the other side, what that might have been like. One of them was a German fighting on the Russian front in World War II. And I was just trying to get a glimpse at, what that might be like if you're on the other side of a sea of humanity. And here's what the German soldiers said about the Russians advancing on the Germans in waves. Quote, "The whole terrain was brown with the overcoats of advancing Russian soldiers. We lay between smoldering piles of rubble, and our officer gave orders that we were to hold our fire until the enemy was within 20 meters. We did, and when we finally opened up, the Russians fell in rows, piling up into a great heap of dead. Most of that first wave had come forward without weapons, cannon fodder, to use up our ammunition. The second wave was like the first, except that a few more of them had rifles. We shot them all down. Then came the third, fourth, and fifth waves." The idea of human wave attacks comes from the ancient strategist Sun Tzu, and it's an extrapolation of something that he says where you want to flow around enemy positions like water. Some states and armies have taken that to mean literally turning your, soldiers into a sea of humanity that just flows over enemy positions. And if there's enough men and human capital that you can sort of waste on these positions and throw them against, the positions like waves on a seashore, eventually you'll take the position. But I try to think too, there's the part of it where you see this sea of humanity coming at you and the fear that would invoke inside of you, just seeing the numbers. But there's the other part of it too, where you're manning a gun. I just wonder if a soldier thinks about what's on the business end of that gun. Like, do you think about the different bodies that you're creating, the corpses that your gun is making? And again, I have no concept of what this might feel like. I haven't been in combat, so I can only extrapolate. But I remember, and this may sound completely unrelated, but it's about all I can really put it to and relate it to make it personal. But I was on a jury for a trial, and I remember when we were back in the back room deliberating, just thinking about how it would affect the person that had committed the crime. And a crime had been committed, and this person was going to be punished for it. But I remember in the jury room, there's this group of us that are just thinking, like, what is this going to do to this person's life? And how is it going to affect the rest of their life? And obviously it was going to be quite a bit different. They were going to go to prison for a good long time. And just that thought is something that it's hard to relate, and it's extrapolated 10, 20, 30-fold, 100-fold when you're dealing death to this wave of humanity at the end of it. It's kind of a formless, shapeless thing, right? But there's humans in this wave. And I just wonder, and have tried to kind of put myself in that situation by thinking, like, would you think about the fact that there's humans on the other end of these bullets that you're shooting out? Karl Marlantes, in his book, What Is It Like to Go to War, relates his own experience being in the American war in Vietnam and just what it's like to kill someone. And he talks about how it boggles the mind because we are taught growing up to sort of value human life and the different ways that extrapolates out to everything that you do. You're taught through societal norms that killing is wrong. And so when you're killing people, something inside of you just recoils at it because everything that you're brought up to believe flies in the face of this act that you're doing, but it's condoned. And so there's this weird conflict within you when you're killing someone. But he says that it's like scoring a game-winning touchdown in the Super Bowl because you're not thinking about it in terms of, that's a human I just killed. You're thinking about it in terms of, that's somebody that can't kill me or my buddies. And everything kind of flips on its head, right? It changes your perspective about what war's really like. We talk about war as being hell, as being awful. I mean, the title of this whole series is Hell in a Small Place. It's about a war, and it's awful, and it makes meat out of human beings. And yet there's just something shocking almost about this idea that it's like scoring the game-winning touchdown in the Super Bowl because you feel like it shouldn't be that way, or maybe you're not allowed to talk about it but that way, but that's what it's like. I found another account of somebody fighting, again, in the American war in Vietnam, and how he's manning a gun in support of infantry fending off a human wave attack. And he says about it, quote, "I used up my 80 rounds in probably 10 minutes, and then I was waiting for a sortie to come in with more ammo. We destroyed our guns. The rate of fire was just more than they were made to do, and we wrecked our guns." He continues on later. And I was listening to it, and you could sort of hear him trail off a bit as he's talking about it, like he's thinking about the best way to describe it. He continues, quote, "War's chaotic. You could just hear the guns up and down the valley and see the smoke. And it was haunting." End quote. Anyways, back to the battle. The French have brought with them something that the Vietnamese haven't quite seen yet. They've brought napalm. And not just napalm, and flamethrowers like it's been used before. They've brought napalm bombs. Napalm is kind of like modern Greek fire almost. It's this sticky, jelly-like substance that just burns and burns and burns, and you can't put it out. And it sticks to your body and turns men into meat. It's horrifying. And the French utilized a ton of these bombs. And these napalm bombs end up being the key element to the battle at Vinh Yên. A Viet Minh officer wrote in his diary about what happened at Vinh Yên, and it's so exhaustive, and it tells us so much about the battle and what it was like to be there that I'd be remiss if I didn't fully dive into it and give him his due. So this lengthy quote from a Viet Minh soldier that fought at Vinh Yên, quote, "Our division has been on the attack ever since this morning. We are forming a group of about 10 elite battalions who should be able to take Viet Tri before tomorrow. The French troops react in terrible fashion. We're waiting here all morning. Here and there one can see the battle develop, but my company, unfortunately, has nothing to do. Yes, we would certainly like to participate in the battle which will decide the fate of Hanoi. It's already January 13th, and Tet will be here in a few weeks, in a month and a half. We want to be in Hanoi for the Tet. To the south, we can hear the guns rumble like drums. French shells are getting closer and closer, and we already have seen some of our wounded leaving the line and coming back to where we are. The platoon commanders come over to me bringing resolutions and petitions from their men. It's always a great comfort to me, before every assault or particularly dangerous action, to feel the unity of the men and the cadres, and with it that of the whole People's Army. I accept all the petitions. Each platoon requests the honor of my being assigned to the most difficult or the most dangerous mission. All of a sudden, a sound can be heard in the sky and the strange birds appear, getting larger and larger, airplanes. I order my men to take cover from the bombs and machine gun bullets, but the planes dived upon us without firing their guns. However, all of a sudden, hell opens in front of my eyes. Hell comes in the form of large, egg-shaped containers dropping from the first plane, followed by other eggs from the second and third plane. Immense sheets of flames, extending over hundreds of meters, it seems, strike terror into the ranks of my soldiers. This is napalm, the fire which falls from the skies. Another plane swoops down behind us and again drops a napalm bomb. The bomb falls closely behind us, and I feel its fiery breath touching my whole body. The men are now fleeing in all directions, and I cannot hold them back. There's no way of holding out under this torrent of fire which flows in all directions and burns everything in its passage. On all sides, flames surround us now. In addition, French artillery and mortars now have our range and transform into a fiery tomb what had been 10 minutes ago a quiet part of the forest. We flee through the bamboo hedges towards the west, and I cry, "Assemble in the woods behind the hill!" But who listens to me and who can hear me? Behind us, French infantry now attacks. We can hear their screams. We are now passing through the platoon which had remained in reserve. I stop at the platoon commander. Try to delay the French as much as possible. I'll try to regroup my men behind the hill. His eyes were wide with terror. What is this, the atomic bomb? No, it's napalm. The men continue to flee in all directions, and I see a political commissar, pistol in hand, trying desperately to regroup them. We can now hear clearly the yells of the enemy who is pursuing us. It's not my intent to sound gratuitous or overly fascinated by the macabre when I'm talking about some of the awful things that humans dealt with during this fighting, but it's the ways that humans inflict horror on one another that are somewhat revealing about the human condition. I say often with these podcasts that the things that makes history come alive is when you can put yourself in the situation where you are somebody involved in these events somehow, abstractly. Obviously, you can't have been there or have experienced these things, but if you can put yourself there a little bit mentally, it makes that historical event come more alive to you. And I try to do that through these shows. And one of the ways you can make these historical events come more alive to you is examining the awful things that humans have done to one another, because we don't tend to talk about them in history. Nation states don't like to talk about the awful things that their people have dealt with in wars. They try to whitewash it a bit or make it sound more glorious than it is. Often in peacetime, when you talk about war, you talk about glory. And you talk about how serving your country is perhaps the greatest thing you can do as a citizen. But when you're in those wars, when you're fighting these battles, when you're seeing the things that these shells and these bullets are doing to bodies around you, you're stripped of all of that glorified talk. Of all those things that they say in peacetime, that just goes away. Napalm is one of those things that it kind of boggles the mind a little bit. It is modern Greek fire in a way, and the things that it does to bodies are just horrifying. I was trying to find examples of what napalm did to people, and I found an account from the Korean War, which is happening essentially concurrently to the events here in Indochina. It's from an Australian, and I didn't catch his name, but it was an audio quote, and I basically got the transcription, and here is his account of witnessing what napalm did to some of his buddies. Quote, "One of the things that happened during the day, in the morning, the Americans accidentally dropped napalm on some of our fellows. We had to tend to them, and, when the fighting withdrawal was on, we had to carry them out, and the Australians won't leave wounded. They might leave their dead, but they won't leave your wounded, and we had to carry those guys. You want to see those guys. There was skin, the napalm, the face. You could see the bone of the jaw sticking out, then elbows and arms, clothes burned off, and just the bone, and even that was burnt brown from the napalm. It was terrible, end quote. It's those kind of things when obviously you know what napalm does, but you get to see it up close and in person and recoil from it a little bit, that you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach where you're there for even just a split second. Vinh Yen, to me, is kind of the turning point of this whole conflict, because while Giap continues to attack the Delta over and over and over again, I think he did it about 3 times and lost, he clearly understood that after Vinh Yen, a set-piece battle was not going to be the way that the Vietnamese were going to drive the French back into the sea. Giap would learn from his mistakes, because the Vietnamese would then revert back to their strategy of, attacking a place at night after the French had taken it during the day and turning this war into one that they felt entirely comfortable they could win. Remember the elephant and the tiger motif from Ho Chi Minh's time in Paris. It's this idea that no matter the cost, this was going to be a total war, a war that they would expend all their human capital if at the end of the day they knew they could still drive the French and the Americans and whoever else would come to colonize Vietnam into the sea. And they still felt like, despite the fact that the French had air superiority, despite the fact that the French held a lot of the large urban areas in the south of Vietnam, the Vietnamese could still make this war untenable. And I'm sure Ho Chi Minh and the others in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam could see the cracks beginning to grow on the foundation of French resistance to the Vietnamese in Vietnam. But things in the war were about to change, because it wasn't just going to be the French fighting in Vietnam. Jean de Lattre made a trip to the United States in 1951. The purpose of the whole trip was to officially gain increased U.S. support in the war in Vietnam, and by all accounts, the trip was a success. I don't know how he spun it in these meetings, de Lattre, because the United States always knew or was conscious of this issue of communism taking over all of Southeast Asia. But whatever he said in these meetings with the Truman administration in the United States, de Lattre made it very clear that the French weren't going to be able to fight this war alone. And the United States had been pledging support before, but he was able to convince them to up it. Part of de Lattre's address to the American people at one point went like this, quote, "The loss of Southeast Asia would mean that communism would have at its disposal essential strategic raw materials, that the Japanese economy would forever be unbalanced, and that the whole of Asia would be threatened," end quote. It's this continued idea of the domino theory that reigned so supreme in politics at the time, that these raw materials like rice and rubber and tin that were so important in Southeast Asia would go into communist hands, and that if it went into communist hands, like we've said, Southeast Asia would just fall one country after the other, and communism would reign supreme. And then you have that nebulous what-if scenario where if all of the East goes communist, what happens next? Does it mean the entire world goes up in a nuclear strike? Do we just blow ourselves off the face of the planet? Or can we coexist? A lot of people thought we couldn't, that it would be another world war. And this is a generation that had just fought World War II, and we're so conscious of what would happen if we got into another conflict like that. And we had just seen the atomic bomb go off a couple of years ago. So it's this nebulous, terrifying possibility that, like Albert Einstein said, this war is fought with modern weapons and guns, but the next one might be fought with sticks and stones. Nevertheless, the New York Times put it like this after de Lattre's journey to the United States, quote, First, we're in basic political agreement with the French. Second, our aid to the Associated States of Indochina will be stepped up. Both are vital. Regardless, the United States has finally entered the fray. While United States troops are not going to set foot in Vietnam for many more years, they're going to bankroll the rest of this war, to the point that many reports and things I've read said that the United States paid for about 80% of the conflict in the French Indochina War. Army Chief of Staff J. Lawton Collins apparently pledged officially to Delattre that the United States deliveries would be stepped up, and this is what Frederick Logval says about the next deliveries to the French in Indochina. Quote, "In the 4 months following his visit, the French received more than 130,000 tons of equipment, including 53 million rounds of ammunition, 8,000 general-purpose vehicles, 650 combat vehicles, 200 aircraft, 14,000 automatic weapons, and 3,500 radios." Keep in mind, too, this is all happening while the United States is fighting a war in Korea. Officially, the microscope has been turned on Southeast Asia, and while Korea would end up in an armistice in 1953, there was growing fear that Indochina was going to be a long, drawn-out conflict. The tiger was jumping out of the jungle, taking enormous strips out of the elephant's hide. And the elephant wasn't just the French any longer. It was the entire West. Between 1947 and 1950, the French think that they can still win the war in Indochina, and yet they are pitted against a power and a zealous government led by Ho Chi Minh, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And it's turning into a knockdown drag-out that the French never thought possible, which is why the events leading up to and into the end of the French Indochina War, the war in Indochina, whatever you want to call it, they are wild, because not only are the events singularly interesting, but it's because the entire world is party to and witness to all the things that are happening. And not just the world, the United States, perhaps the foremost superpower in the world. And it's the United States that needs to figure out if they're going to put up or shut up when it comes to Southeast Asia. They have been leading policy, but they haven't been placing boots on the ground. In the conclusion of the French war in Indochina, they're going to have to decide internally how far are they willing to go in defense of the domino theory that has so dominated policy in the United States. All of that and more in Hell in a Small Place, Part 2.